Hello, all my dear followers. Welcome to the second and final season of What If Kurama Were a Woman and Was Nice to Naruto. From the start, I hope you like it and ask that you give it a chance. As always, I ask for your like and subscription to keep growing. Enjoy.
Age 16, Part 1. 2 weeks later, somewhere in eastern rice field country, Yujito sighed as she swirled the remaining broth of her meal with her chopsticks, watching as it spun about clockwise inside her bowl. It wasn't that she disliked ramen, as it was she hardly ever ate the stuff, but it was a little too salty for her. The deeper problem was likely that she wasn't very hungry in the first place, but this was the designated meeting place of her latest mission, so she figured she may as well buy something while here. A frown worked its way over her face as she thought about her current situation. She had been at the gates of Cloud Village, ready to depart on a solo A-rank mission just about a week ago that seemed like it would be a walk in the park. However, one of the Bolt operatives caught up with her just as she was getting ready to depart, stating that Raikage-sama wished to see her before she left. Apparently it was urgent and her mission was going to be shifted to another shinobi. She was surprised. Raikage-sama never called on her in a manner like this, at least not with any expressed urgency, so she immediately followed the Bolt operative back towards the central compound. She had to admit to herself that she was a little peeved at losing such an easy mission too, but in the long run it was of little consequence. "Excuse me, miss, is there anything wrong with your meal?" Yujito looked up, surprised. She quickly realized it was the elderly man who had served her the ramen, and he was giving her a curious, if somewhat apprehensive look. The young woman immediately stopped stirring the broth, waving him off apologetically. Oh no, I'm fine, really. I just got lost in thought, is all." The gentle smile he offered as he nodded immediately relaxed her. "I see. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. Take your time, young miss." "I will, thank you." As he moved over to assist one of the other customers nearby, Yujito slowly looked down at the still spinning broth in her bowl. For no particular reason, she started moving her chopsticks in it, counterclockwise this time. As the broth began swirling in the other direction, she once again thought back as to why she was here. It surprised her that when she arrived, Killer Bee was already there, and he had an unusually serious expression on his face as he talked with his brother, the Raikage, in hushed tones. They immediately looked to her as she entered, and Ei-sama wasted no time in explaining why he had called her here. Jiraiya of the Densetsu no Sannin had sent a message through to the Raikage via his network. Courtesy of the Kyubi Jinchuriki, he was willing to offer a technique that could assist the Jinchuriki of Cloud in further developing their rapport with their Biju. There was no catch, as apparently the Kyubi Jinchuriki felt as if all Jinchuriki were like family to him, even if they had never met. On top of that, it was a personal request of the Kyubi that he offer this technique as well. Both Killer Bee and herself looked at each other for a moment before looking at the Raikage once again, neither one really believing what they had heard. Even if they didn't know intricate details, they knew that the Kyubi Jinchuriki was younger than they both were, but he was presuming to offer them some way to work better with their Biju that they didn't know about. Yujito was about to scoff and say forget it, until the Raikage stopped her in her tracks. "I know what both of you are thinking. There is no way someone younger than you can know more about his Biju than either of you do. However," Ei sighed before rubbing at his forehead, "think about the source of this message. It's Jiraiya of the Densetsu no Sannin. Of the three, he is known as the most honorable of the lot, and nothing he says is to be taken lightly. I've had backroom dealings with him before. I don't know." Yujito mumbled, more to herself than anyone else. She looked over towards B, expecting him to say something, or anything, really. Instead he continued to stare at his brother, one arm across his chest as his other hand rubbed his chin. "Other than the fact that you may actually learn something, this is a win-win situation politically. If we go along with this small request, it will look good to Konoha. I know there is no love lost between our villages, but since they already have Suna in their back pocket, I'd rather stand with those two rather than remain solitary like Kiri and Iwa." Yujito frowned, but couldn't really see a problem with it, now that the Raikage had clarified. They really didn't have anything to lose, and as a Jinchuriki she could take virtually everything thrown at her. If it was a trap and she did get into some kind of scrap with the Kyubi Jinchuriki, she believed that her experience would help her turn the tide. "I'm not sure about this, they might try to get in some hits. But if this really is on the down low, maybe we should just go with the flow. The surprisingly quiet Killer Bee finally made a comment, though in his usual rhyme. Yujito had finally gotten used to it after training with the man for so long, but the Raikage still began to twitch, forcefully reining himself in. If they do, it's their funeral. I'm sending both of you, though only Yujito will meet with them, at first, anyway. If she enters combat, you'll go assist her immediately. I'm sure both of you together will have no trouble subduing the Kyuubi. Don't engage for long, though. If a fight breaks out, do a tactical retreat. Jiraiya will be there, and the information can access is second to none. Even if his services are expensive, I'd rather not lose that resource. Quiet night, isn't it? Yujito jumped up a little from her stool, caught completely off guard. She couldn't believe that she was so distracted that she didn't notice. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle a pretty woman such as yourself. She narrowed her eyes as she turned to her right, curious about who would be so blatant in trying to flirt with her after only the second sentence. When she did look, however, the tall man with a lot of bright white hair simply gave her a creepy-looking grin. He wasn't grinning in the picture of him that she saw that they had on file in Cloud, which was admittedly several years old, but the familiarity was enough that she easily figured out who the man was. Yujito suddenly found herself shivering a little. It was well known that any of the Densetsu no Sannin could likely match any Kage in pure combat talent, and one of them was sitting right next to her. Even if she was a Jinchuriki and had plenty of power, a man like Jiraiya had easily 3 times the experience she did. You must be Dash. Jiraiya held a hand up, expression serious, which stalled her comment. He simply nodded at her, then gave her a simple gesture to follow him. Nodding silently, she turned and quickly downed the rest of the broth from her meal, then left some money on the counter before departing from the stand. He was waiting patiently outside when she exited, then turned and began to walk as soon as he knew she saw him. Their stroll was silent as she followed a couple paces behind him, but she quickly moved closer as it was becoming apparent that they were leaving the small village. Where are we going? Jiraiya turned his head to the side a little bit, glancing at her from the corner of his eye before facing forward again. Naruto is waiting in a camp not far from here. What we have to say and offer, it would be for the best if there were fewer chances of us being overheard. Where is Killer Bee, by the way? Yujito decided it would be best to be friendly, but still be wary as her profession demanded. He's shy. But he's aware of our conversation. Jiraiya tossed her an amused look, to which she smiled faintly and then gently tapped the collar of her tunic. The Toad Sage nodded, understanding that she was wired so that Killer Bee could hear what was going on. It became obvious that the Raikage obviously didn't completely trust the offer, which wasn't surprising considering the history between their villages. He was willing to potentially risk one of his Jinchuriki, but not both of them. A small part of him felt stirrings of pity for Yujito since she was obviously the expendable one, though she probably wouldn't appreciate those feelings if she was at all like Naruto. Is Naruto the name of Konoha's Jinchuriki? Jiraiya nodded as he faced forward again. Yes. You didn't know that? We only knew that the Kyuubi Jinchuriki was located in Konoha. After the death of your Yondaime Hokage and Uzumaki Kushina, we thought the Kyuubi had been killed, as Konoha claimed. But when it did not appear again approximately 9 years later, we knew Konoha had lied, and probably had a new Kyuubi Jinchuriki. As to who it was, however, I don't believe we ever found out. At least I was never informed. The white-haired man hummed to himself after hearing Yujito's comments. He was actually surprised that they still had no idea who it was, but perhaps she wasn't high enough on the chain of command to be told. It was a moot point now, anyway. I'll let him introduce himself to you. We're almost there. The rest of their journey was silent, the only noises to accompany them were those of nature as the sun slowly disappeared and nocturnal creatures made their presence known. They weren't very far out of town before Jiraiya steered them off the path, into the nearby woods. As they passed into the trees, Yujito felt herself tense up slightly. If anything bad were to happen, it likely would soon. However, as time passed and they moved further into the trees, she wasn't sure what to think. Trying to do something to keep her mind off the fact that she was alone with someone who could likely take her out on a whim, she asked how much further they had to walk. We're almost there, I'm fairly sure. We'll probably be seeing the campfire soon. Sure enough, no more than a minute after he said that, Yujito noticed a flickering orange light in the distance. At the same time, Jiraiya looked over his shoulder at her and pointed towards it, to which she nodded. As they approached the small clearing where the camp was located, Yujito's eyes settled on a young man, probably in his mid to late teens, who was sitting on a log with his back to them. He sat up straighter and looked over his shoulder slightly as they approached, but then settled back down. "Welcome back," Jiraiya grunted as he walked around to the other side of the fire, sitting down on another piece of wood. Unsure as to what was going to happen now, Yujito moved so that she was facing the fire, but several steps away from it, between Naruto and Jiraiya, so she could see both of them. "Ero Sennin, I thought you said there were two." Jiraiya's immediate reply was cut off as Yujito quickly stifled a chortle, holding her hand over her mouth and blushing as she looked between the both of them with wide eyes. She couldn't help herself, knowing that Jiraiya was called such a name by a teenager, to his face, no less. Jiraiya ignored her, and simply chose to send a glare at his apprentice. "What have I said about calling me that in front of others? Not to." The sage sighed, rubbing at his forehead. "Right. Anyway, as I told you before, we don't exactly have the best history between our villages. Killer Bee is listening in, but just in case this was a trap, he isn't here. To be honest, I'm surprised that the Raikage even sent one of you." Yujito nodded slowly. "He pulled me off another mission to come here." Something about Jiraiya changed, and he stared at her for a moment. "Was it an A-rank mission that looked rather easy?" "It would have been easy for me, yes, why?" The man seemed to deflate, but in such a way that could be interpreted as relief. "I'm glad the Raikage followed through then. I just found out before we came here, after I sent my request to the Raikage, that some A-rank missions were being sent to villages to lure out Jinchuriki." "Lures? You don't mean?" Jiraiya nodded slowly. "Yes. I feel sorry for whatever team ended up with that mission, if Akatsuki decides to take out their aggravation on them. The only reason I was aware of it was because I've got eyes on some of the bank accounts they've used, and one of my people was able to trace where some of their money went. This isn't the first time they've tried this, it's only the latest in a series of attempts. They set up what looks like a standard mission, then ambush you. The rumor is that Iwa and Kiri have both lost a Jinchuriki this way." Yujito stared at the fire and nodded, trying not to appear startled and also not being surprised at the lengths Akatsuki might go to get at any Jinchuriki. Potentially any mission she would go on could be a trap, and she'd never know until too late. Figuring it was time to get back to her original reason for being out here, she moved her focus from the flames towards the toad sage once again. "So, you were saying something in your letter about helping me interact better with Nibi?" A motion in the corner of her eyes caused her focus to shift over towards the boy, Naruto. However, instead of looking at her, he was staring over the fire at the sage as well. "Yes." At this point, even though it pains me to admit it, Jiraiya held a hand over his heart and grimaced. "Naruto is more knowledgeable about the particulars of this since he is actually the one that made it. I've just been along for the ride." Yujito's eyebrows raised slightly as she took in the form of the young man who was still sitting on the log. If she had to be honest with herself, if she was facing him as an opponent, he didn't really look like much. She chided herself at the same time, however, because if there was one thing they learned early in their careers, it was that someone who seemed completely unlike they would be much of a threat often make the best predators. The very fact that he was the Kyubi Jinchuriki greatly reinforced this notion. Yujito watched as he finally shifted his attention over to her, and she almost had to do a double take. His eyes and hair alone were very familiar, and though she knew she had never seen him before in her life, it was almost like she had seen a picture of someone who looked very similar to him sometime in the past. His eyes were very bright and sharp, and Yujito felt both amusement and a tiny surge of arousal as she noticed them travel up and down her body once before settling on her face. She would have threatened to kill most men who looked at her that way, but she had to admit that this Naruto was a rather good-looking guy, a Jinchuriki like her, and was at least somewhat intelligent if he was as good at seals as the sage claimed. Besides, beating him now for letting his eyes wander would likely cause him to take back whatever he was willing to offer. Yujito was pulled from her thoughts when he finally spoke again. "The first thing I need to do is know what kind of seal you have and where it is. I may have to modify the one that I use for the Kyubi, if yours isn't 8 trigrams. The Kumo Kunoichi had to admit what he said just went right over her head. To be honest, I have no idea. I'm not that good with sealing myself. Okay. Then I'll have to take a look at it to see it. Naruto grunted a little as he finally stood up. I don't know where your seal is located though, mine is around my navel. Yujito nodded and started to reach for the zipper of her jacket, only to stop and look towards the sage. She had heard rumors about the man, and if the way he was staring at her now, notebook and pen in hand, she really didn't want him around. Luckily for her, Naruto decided to save her some embarrassment and cleared his throat, gaining Jiraiya's attention. Ero Sennin. Wasn't there a brothel in town? Yeah, but I think I can get better research here. What do you think is going to happen here? Don't make me summon Kitsune. Naruto's voice had dropped as if it was a clear threat, and surprisingly Jiraiya immediately jumped to his feet and took off, saying not to worry and have fun. Sorry about that. Naruto was shaking his head and rubbing the back of his neck. At least some things never change, I guess. It's alright. It seems as though you know how to handle him. Yujito gave him a small smile, and started tugging on the zipper of her tunic again. By the way, is this Kitsune, the Kyuubi? Naruto chuckled. How'd you guess? Seriously? The name gave it away pretty easily. They did say it would be obvious, but Kitsune didn't really care, so the name stuck. Naruto smirked a little before his look became more expectant, and finally settled into one of puzzlement. What? The teenaged boy gestured towards her stomach. Weren't you going to show me your seal? You stopped. Yujito looked down, the hand that had been pulling her zipper down had stopped just below her collarbone. It wasn't until that moment that what she was about to do actually clicked in her mind. She was unzipping her top in front of a shinobi from another nation, even if it was another Jinchuriki. One that was obviously younger than her, though probably not by much. She removed her hand from the zipper, then shifted to place both hands on her hips as she stared at him. Before I show you my seal, exactly what am I going to be getting out of this? Naruto blinked for a moment as he stared at her. They didn't tell you. Yujito shook her head. All I heard was that I'd be able to work better with Nibi. Nothing more. I'd like to hear why before I strip in front of someone I just met. Strip. Naruto looked away, down towards the ground, clearly embarrassed. I just needed to see the seal so I can create a summoning array for you. That's all, huh? Yujito went still, looking at the teen in front of her with wide eyes. Did you just say summon? I'll be able to summon Nibi out here without breaking the seal. Naruto slowly returned his gaze to Yujito, who seemed to be completely flabbergasted. Sort of. You can't summon Nibi completely, but you can summon its mind and some of its chakra into a clone that you make. I use a shadow clone. I don't know how to make a shadow clone. Yujito began to frown. She didn't want to miss out on this because she didn't know a technique that was native to Konoha. The shadow clone is part of the summoning array of the seal now, so you don't need to know it. You just need a lot of chakra. The more chakra you put into the clone, the more of Nibi's chakra you can place into the clone as well. Depending on how things work out, I may be able to switch the seal to use a lightning clone, or whatever type you prefer. Before Yujito could say anything, Naruto reached into one of his pockets and pulled out a small scroll that he quickly unraveled. Yujito watched closely as Naruto kneeled down to the ground, unfurling the scroll in the process. Setting it down on a patch of dirt, he placed his hand in the middle of the seal and looked up at her. This seal used to be about 5 times this size. With Kitsune's and Ero Sennin's help I've been able to shrink it down to fit into this scroll. Looking back down at his hand again, she noticed a blue glow form around it, which meant he was pumping a lot of his own chakra into this technique. He never said a word, though, and within seconds there was a large burst of smoke that caused her to take an involuntary step backward. As the smoke cleared, Yujito saw another hand appear from within and start to wave it away. Almost immediately a form became visible as the smoke cleared. It didn't take long for the figure to register as a female with shoulder-length red hair that ended with black tips. That itself was rather unique. The woman was very pretty too, with sharp features, bright red eyes that almost seemed to glow, and a figure that Yujito would die, or preferably, kill for. If nothing else, she was surprised by how young the summon of Kyubi looked. She would have figured that Kyubi would have been much older, though perhaps there was more to her than met the eye. Kyubi. The redhead nodded slowly as she took a step towards Yujito, stepping off the scroll on the ground. As Naruto collected it, Kyubi began talking to her. You can call me Kitsune. That is the name we decided on. I see. She frowned slightly, looking the Biju over once again. I thought Biju didn't have a gender. How do I know you aren't just some transformation over a shadow clone? Kitsune stared straight ahead at Yujito, not breaking eye contact. I initially decided on this form because Naruto is male and when we spar it would help him prepare for intense confrontations. As for me really being a Biju, would you like me to explain what Ginkaku and Kinkaku tasted like when I ate them? Yujito's eyes widened briefly before she turned away, looking slightly green. And no, that's alright. I believe you, for now. Good. For now. Kitsune waved at her with a dismissing gesture. Show us your seal. Suddenly feeling nervous, Yujito grabbed at the zipper once again, pulling it down slowly. Once it finally split apart at her waist, she used both hands to pull open the front slightly, enough to reveal her toned abs, navel, and chest, which she was glad that she had decided to wrap with tape today. Naruto, what are you doing? Let's get to work on this. Yujito looked at the teen, and immediately grinned. He had obviously been trying not to stare, even though she had only opened her front. He probably didn't realize that her chest was bound in tape, and didn't think about it until she had actually unzipped completely. Would it help if I took the rest of my top off? Yujito couldn't keep the small grin off her face, and the only thing that did eventually remove it was when Kitsune let out a low growl. Looking towards the Biju now, she was relieved to find that it was actually growling at Naruto, who was still having trouble looking at her and blushing even more than before. Naruto. I thought we'd been training for this. It's a good thing we aren't fighting or you'd be dead by now. I know. I know. I'm sorry. I'll focus. Naruto forced himself to look at her, to which she simply offered him a wry grin. His hands bunched up into fists before he let out a deep breath and apparently decided to stare at her stomach instead. Yujito looked towards Kitsune again, to see that the redhead was watching Naruto intently, though figuring out what her current expression meant was completely beyond her understanding. Yujito watched and waited patiently for several minutes, holding her top open as Naruto carefully examined the seal on her stomach. She had to admit that his look of concentration was rather cute, and had to forcefully keep a few smiles off her face when she saw him attempt to touch her stomach to trace a part of the seal, only to yank his hand back as if burned. His blushes and muttered apologies only endeared her towards him more. Normally she probably would have made a few comments, if only to ease any tension, but the way Kitsune was staring back and forth between herself and Naruto gave her an uncomfortable vibe. She didn't want to say it was fear keeping her from asking Kitsune if there was a problem, but that likely had something to do with it. She only contained the Nibi, there was no way she wanted to get into a pissing match with the Kyubi over anything, even if the Hachibi was nearby for backup. Alright. Your seal isn't too much different than mine, though since you only have an iron armor seal you'll probably be able to make a clone out of Nibi's chakra without needing to use your own. We can test it here, but there are some things I want to verify in a book I left at home. Naruto looked back and forth between her and Kitsune as she talked, explaining to both of them. Yujito nodded as she started to zip up her top again. So do you need me to come with you? Naruto looked at her, obviously surprised. With Kitsune it was harder to tell, though her eyebrows did raise as well. You can come with us to Konoha. I thought I'd go make the seal and then we could meet up again, or I'd send a clone to deliver it to you in Kumo. Yujito shook her head. This was a mission that was assigned to me by Raikage-sama, so I can go wherever I need to. It makes sense for me to just go with you, especially in case you need to check the seal again. Killer Bee will report my whereabouts to Raikage-sama. In fact, if I know him, he's probably upset that he won't get to go too. Unless, of course, Raikage-sama changes his stay in Kaminari rule. Naruto shrugged, obviously indifferent, then looked around the camp. I'll clean up camp and we'll head into town to grab Ero Sennin, then leave for Konoha. Unless you're tired. Yujito shook her head negatively, and Naruto turned to look at his Biju. Do you want to dispel or stay out here? Kitsune stared at him, then flicked her gaze over towards Yujito for a moment. I think I'll stay out here for a while. Something about the way Kitsune looked at her, followed by the tone of voice, sent a shiver down her spine. This was probably going to be a very long trip. The next afternoon, somewhere in northern Fire Country, the traveling rumble of an explosion caused the small group of travelers to pause and listen for any follow-up sounds to try and isolate where it came from. Naruto began to stretch out his senses, only for Jiraiya to shout out to follow him, then run into the forest. Yujito and Kitsune followed immediately after, and without a word Naruto settled into the rear of their makeshift formation. It didn't take long for them to encounter the source of the noises, a team of Konoha shinobi facing off against two people wearing black cloaks with red clouds. Akatsuki. Naruto recognized all the members of the team from Konoha, but before he could say anything he overheard the two Akatsuki members start to chat loudly with each other. Hey, Kakuzu. Isn't that, yes, our no-show Nibi Jinchuriki from last week? It would seem she was meeting up with the Kyubi Jinchuriki. Jiraiya is here as well, It is convenient to not have to hunt down the Jinchuriki, but this will not be an easy fight, Haiden. The member with white hair began laughing like a maniac as he swung his scythe around. Alright, whatever. Lord Jashin is going to love this. First I got to sacrifice those replacements sent instead of the Nibi Jinchuriki, and now we get even more. Shut up and focus, Haiden. This is going to be nothing like you've ever faced before. Bah, who cares, bastard. We're immortal, so what can they hope to do against us? Bring it on, I say. Naruto began to tune them out as they continued talking back and forth to each other, and instead changed his focus to observe his own allies and their surroundings. They were a decent length from any well-traveled path, so the chances of anyone else showing up were small unless they knew exactly where to look. Jiraiya had already landed near the Konoha team and was conversing with them, which looked to consist of Asuma, Shikamaru, Izumo, and Kotetsu. Naruto had landed just inside the clearing, not wanting to bunch up too close with the others in case Akatsuki attacked them. Yujito was standing a few steps away from him, obviously agitated, while Kitsune was standing on his other side and still appeared to be rather calm about the entire situation. Naruto. You and Yujito hang back for now. We'll take care of this. Jiraiya shouted over to them, for some reason sending Haiden into a laughing fit. Naruto wasn't happy about being held back, and was about to argue until Kitsune put a hand on his shoulder. Kitsune. What? Wait for an opening. Let them cause a distraction, then use your new technique. How long can you hold it now? About a minute if I concentrate. That should be long enough. Yujito took the few steps over to them. What technique? This involves me too, I don't want to sit here and do nothing. Naruto was going to answer, but Kitsune squeezed his shoulder and answered for him, with a decidedly feral smile on her face. When the time comes, we may need you to be a distraction. Naruto has an attack that I'm certain will kill at least one of these two. Yujito gestured towards the two Akatsuki, who had started defending against fire attacks from Asuma and Jiraiya. Didn't they just finish boasting about immortality? No one is truly immortal. Kitsune slowly shook her head. It is likely some special technique or ability. If the first sage of 6 paths could not gain immortality, then no other shinobi can claim something he could not obtain. Even the Biju can die, though we are reborn after a time. Our energy cannot simply disappear. Kitsune had to stop talking as a nearby explosion kicked up dirt and debris around them, and they all had to shield themselves from it. Throughout it all, Haiden could still be heard laughing, along with Kakuzu's shouts telling his partner to shut up. Our opening will likely come soon. Prepare yourself. Kitsune grabbed Naruto's arm and pulled him behind her. Yujito and I will go in front of you and hold Kakuzu when he lets his guard down. When we grab him, get behind him and use your technique. We likely won't be able to hold him down for long. Hopefully the others will be able to handle Haiden, if not we will help deal with him later. Naruto nodded, then went wide-eyed as a fireball began heading right for them. He saw Yujito move away in his peripheral vision, but Kitsune was still facing him and wouldn't notice until too late. Kitsune's eyes went wide as Naruto jumped towards her. Wrapping his arms around her torso, he quickly jumped out of the way of the oncoming ball of fire. Landing on a tree branch a fair distance away, the shockwave of heat and debris washed over them not a moment after Naruto touched down. The blonde turned and looked over his shoulder at where the fireball landed, noticing several small fires that had started in the nearby brush, as well as a decently sized crater where they had been standing before. "You can let go of me now." Surprised, Naruto turned to face forward, only to realize that he was still holding Kitsune in his arms, and his face was barely a couple inches away from hers. Even though he was surprised, his motor functions were non-responsive as he simply stared into her bright red eyes. Naruto. Hearing his name was enough to snap him out of his funk. It took seconds for him to release her and promptly jump a few meters backwards on the branch, until his back hit the tree trunk. As he began to stutter out apologies, his face began to turn the color of Kitsune's hair. "Save your apologies. Why did you move me, W.A.? You were going to be hit by an attack. Why wouldn't I save you?" Kitsune simply stared at him for a moment. "I'm in the body of a clone." I would have dispelled. It only made it worse that she stated the fact with no inflection in her voice, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Naruto felt his embarrassment start to fade, only to be replaced by shock and anger. "So what? I still didn't want to see you get dispelled because of a fireball. What if you weren't a clone?" Kitsune's head tilted slightly to the left, in her now customary display of curiosity. "I would not have let it get the best of me if I was not a clone. I felt it coming, and still had enough time to move." The teen opened his mouth to continue, but Yujito landed on another branch slightly above them, causing the duo to look up at her. "Are we continuing with the plan from before?" "Yes." Kitsune spoke up before Naruto could say anything. "Like we discussed. We will hold him down and otherwise attempt keep him distracted, while Naruto moves in for the killing blow with his new technique." Not giving Naruto a chance to get a word in, the redhead moved towards the battle. Yujito tossed Naruto a glance of her own before promptly following. "What the hell?" Naruto grumbled under his breath. He didn't know why he was getting so worked up over Kitsune not immediately trying to avoid that fireball, but it would have to wait until after this fight. He promptly made two other clones to help him with his newest technique, and they all nodded to each other before following after the other two. That evening, Konoha. Naruto sighed for what was probably the 100th time that day as he sat on his hospital bed. The fight had gone exactly as planned. Kitsune and Yujito had snuck up and grabbed Kakuzu, who was too busy trying to figure out what they were doing and ignoring him. Since Asuma, Izumo, and Kotetsu were doing a pretty good job of keeping his other masks occupied, Kakuzu didn't recognize the screeching noise of the Raisin Shuriken right away. By the time he did notice Naruto, the blonde was upon him with the new deadly technique. Yujito had moved away perhaps a little before she should have, probably out of worry about getting caught in the technique's blast, but Kitsune had decided to hang on until the last minute and was dispelled as a result. Luckily they had only had to do it once. Kakuzu was evidently the long-range combatant of their Akatsuki team, as Jiraiya simply covered Haiden in toad oil then lit him on fire. The group watched as the man flailed and screamed and cursed for a good 3 minutes minimum before finally falling unconscious from the pain. Apparently he had some kind of impressive regeneration ability, because even when he was unconscious when the fire was out, they watched as his body quickly healed itself. They bound him securely, made sure Kakuzu was dead with a finishing blow courtesy of Asuma, then sealed both of their bodies into scrolls and returned to Konoha. The return trip was pleasant for the most part. Jiraiya, Asuma, and Shikamaru were obviously impressed by the Raisin Shuriken, and Kotetsu and Izumo kept thanking Naruto for showing up every few minutes. Naruto was trying to be gracious and polite, claiming Kitsune was the one who came up with the idea, but they continued to thank him regardless. He probably would have been laughing more if Kitsune hadn't decided to continue holding Kakuzu long enough to get herself dispelled. As it was, his right hand and most of his forearm still burned like crazy because of using the Raisin Shuriken. Some of the backlash had caught him as well, and it must have torn up something in his arm. He could barely channel any chakra through it, as he discovered when he tried to summon Kitsune again. At first he was going to yell at her, but after a while of thinking about it, decided it was probably in his best interests to chill out for a little while. She'd just call him a fool anyway for not making use of her as a resource, especially when she could be summoned again. It may have been a little bit childish, but he didn't bother visiting her in his mindscape either. He turned to look at the door as it opened, one of the nurses leaned in and gave him a brief smile. Haruno-san asked me to stop by and see if you were okay. How are you feeling? Naruto scratched at the side of his head with his good hand, offering the nurse a resigned smile. My hand itches a bit, but for the most part it's fine. I'm bored as hell, though. The nurse nodded, her expression trying to offer him either sympathy or pity, he couldn't tell. Probably both. Hokage-sama ordered that you were not to leave this room until she could get here herself later this evening. She wasn't happy with what Haruno-san reported to her about what you did to your arm, and wishes to inspect it herself. Yeah. Why did they give this to me anyway? I'm pretty sure I'm all healed by now. Naruto held up his arm that was in the hard cast. In all his time as a shinobi, and even before, he had never needed one. It's not like he had a broken bone. Even if he did, he doubted it would take more than a day or two to heal. Hokage-sama said it would be harder for you to escape with only one hand, so it would be in our best interests as we need you to remain here until Hokage-sama gives you permission to leave. Naruto grumbled under his breath, and he knew he heard the nurse try to stifle a giggle at his reaction. He turned to look back out the window again, figuring she had finished telling him everything, only for her to begin speaking once again. I'm also told to remind you that Hokage-sama has prohibited visitors, so that nothing would happen to aggravate what was wrong with your arm, but it seems she gave special permission for one visitor. Would you like me to send them in? Naruto looked at the nurse in surprise. When Sakura was checking and trying to heal his arm, she had already banned anyone from visiting his room directly. At first he joked with her that she was just being possessive, and got a bonk on the head for it. He did notice, however, that she didn't immediately deny it, and simply called him an idiot. Then she went on to explain that it was standard procedure to not allow visitors until the doctors had cleared their patients, and she wasn't going to clear him until after talking with Tsunade. Since Tsunade still hadn't been to see him yet, he still hadn't been cleared for visitors. Sure. Do you know who it is? The nurse shook her head as she turned to leave the room. It's a blonde-haired woman, that is all I can really say about her. A relative of you, or Hokage-sama, or the Yamanakas, perhaps. There aren't many blondes in the village, so I can only guess. I'll let her know to come up. The nurse disappeared through the door before Naruto could say anything else, not that he had anything to share with the nurse. He had no living relatives that he knew of, neither did Tsunade, and of the Yamanaka clan he only knew of Ino, her father, and one of her uncles that he had a passing encounter with. His hair color was very rare in general, something he had noticed long ago when trying to imagine other people being long-lost family. There was one other person it could be, but he didn't see why. He must have been lost in thought for longer than he intended, as a light knock on his door snapped him out of his reverie. Come in. Almost immediately the door to his room opened one again, only for mild surprise to show on his features as Yujito walked through and gently closed the door behind herself. How are you feeling? Her words snapped him from his brief funk, and he simply offered her a wry grin, holding up his covered arm. Fine. I don't think I need this anymore, but Tsunade-chan won't take it off without seeing me first. Otherwise, I'm just really bored. Yujito nodded, offering a brief smile before moving across the room to go look out the window. Naruto kept his eyes on her as she moved across the room, not seeing anything different about her compared to when they met or fought Akatsuki. It was also surprising that she was able to move around without an escort, though he knew she was probably at least under observation. I'm surprised that Kitsune isn't here. Naruto's mind immediately snapped back to their skirmish with Akatsuki, a small frown crossing his features. I can't channel chakra through my arm very well, and I don't want to mess anything up. Besides, I didn't know if I felt like it anyway. Why not? Her plan worked, didn't it? Naruto frustratingly rubbed at his cheek with his good hand. Yeah, but she didn't move out of the way and kept holding on to that Kakuzu guy when the Raisin Shuriken connected. It forced her to dispel. Even if he wasn't looking at her anymore, he could tell she was scrutinizing him closely. So you are upset. That's amusing, since she can be summoned at any time. Naruto huffed, and tried to cross both of his arms, only for the position to become awkward with one of his arms in a cast. He grumbled as they dropped back down to his sides. I know she would say the same thing. I don't like it. If she wasn't just a summon right now, she could have been Dash. But she is, so she wasn't harmed. Yujito cut him off sharply, making the younger blonde wince as he met her eyes. Are you really a shinobi? Even if she was only a summon, aren't you supposed to harden your emotions against things like this? It's not that easy, Naruto mumbled. Kitsune has helped me more than anyone else in my entire life. So seeing her dispelled by my own technique, if she had been real. As his voice trailed off and he looked at his hands, Yujito's eyes softened slightly as she watched him. Perhaps I should change the subject. There are some things Hokage-sama wanted me to talk to you about before she visits you later. Besides, from what I have been able to understand about Kitsune, she will probably yell at you later. Yujito couldn't keep the smile off her face as Naruto pouted, then grumbled something she couldn't quite make out. He likely believed the same thing would happen. Hopefully she could be around when he finally was able to summon her again. 6 days later, Naruto scratched at his head as he examined the new seal for Yujito. She would be stopping by later today to test it out, and even though he was nervous, he'd never admit that to anyone. It wouldn't be a problem if he was using this on himself, but he wasn't. This seal was completely custom, made for use by Yujito. Sure, the principle of what the seal did was based on his own, but Yujito had a completely different containment seal, which meant the summoning array used for his own would not work for hers. Nervous? Naruto turned his head slightly to look at Kitsune from the corner of his eyes. She knew he was, of course, much as she seemed to know everything about him. It would be hard for her not to, since she seemed to pay more attention to the things that went through his head lately since meeting Yujito. Come to think of it, several things about Kitsune had changed. For starters, he had totally expected her to yell at him when he summoned her again, 3 days later. However, she had simply given him a clipped smile and proceeded as if it was a completely normal summoning. Not about to look a gift horse in the mouth, he played along, and even now nothing had been discussed. Yes, but you already know I am, right? Kitsune nodded slowly, then sat down next to him at the small table he had been doing his work on. As she sat down, she offered the blonde a few pieces of paper, the completed seal design that she had been looking over. Well, Kitsune nodded at him as he grabbed the sheets. I can see no faults. It should work fine. After taking a deep breath, Naruto brushed his free hand back through his spiky hair just as there was a knocking sound on his apartment door. Knowing who it was, he tossed Kitsune a quick glance before standing up to go answer it. This was going to be the moment of truth for his new creation. He opened the door to see Yujito standing there with a small smile on her face. Hey, Naruto. Is it ready? Yes. He stood back away from the entrance, gesturing for her to come inside. As she walked inside, she offered him a quick nod in passing, then proceeded directly to the room where they had been working on the seal previously. After getting all the information he had needed about her particular seal, he had asked her for 5 days to finish it. Today was the 5th day. Naruto had to admit to himself that he was surprised the Raikage allowed Yujito to stay here as long as she did, but since he was helping her and they had indirectly saved her from being captured by Akatsuki, the leader of Kumo was probably willing to go along with them. For now, anyway. After closing the door, he followed in the footsteps of the other blonde-haired Jinchuriki back to the room he had just left. Yujito had already occupied the chair that Naruto had vacated, and was eagerly looking over the various seals that were written on the various pieces of paper scattered about. Kitsune had since moved away from the table, and was observing Yujito with a passive expression. The Biju had been rather tight-lipped when it came to discussing the other Jinchuriki at any length, and unless it was about the seal, she generally chose not to comment, no matter what Naruto said. Naruto moved to stand next to the other Jinchuriki, grabbing for one specific piece of paper on the desk. Yujito stopped looking around and watched him as he offered it to her. This is it. It was harder than I thought it would be, but I did it. Both Kitsune and Erosenin checked it, so there shouldn't be any problems. Shouldn't be. Yujito had her eyebrows raised as she accepted the paper with the intricate design. She had to admit that it did look a lot more complicated than the ones she had seen her fellow blonde using. I can't guarantee it will be perfect, that's the risk taken with any new seal. You can only test to see if it works. I've added a lot of safety seals over the summoning seal, so if something does go wrong we'll all be safe. I understand. Yujito eyed the paper with the intricate design on it, silently marveling at the work that must have gone into it. There were lines of multiple sizes, all at precise angles. She never had as much appreciation for the amount of work that likely went into seals as she did looking at this one. No wonder some seal tags cost so much. Naruto gestured to a relatively clutter-free area of his room. You can try the summon right there. The Nibi will appear in a copy of yourself. Just stand over the seal and make the ram seal to perform the summoning technique. The seal will take care of the rest. Doing as instructed, Yujito moved to the middle of the cleared area and gently set the sealing paper down on the floor. Taking a deep breath, she moved to stand over it, and turned to face Naruto. The Cloud Shinobi immediately noticed that Kitsune had moved over to stand next to him, her expression still completely impassive. Naruto, on the other hand, appeared to be positively giddy. He was staring at her with a big smile on his face, nodding for her to continue. Taking a deep breath, Yujito brought her hands together into the ram sign, and concentrated on her chakra. She mumbled the name of the summoning technique, and after feeling a rather decent tug on both her chakra and that of the Nibi, a burst of smoke appeared in front of her. She came face to face with herself, as she was warned. However, she had never seen one of her lightning clones actually looking both as pleased and surprised as this one was. Oh, so it worked, Naya. Yujito blinked and stared. Her mouth was agape at the verbal tick added to the end of the sentence. Part of her was completely embarrassed as she did not believe she would ever talk like that, but before she could say a thing Naruto had moved over and was already asking the summon a barrage of questions. If it was in fact the Nibi, it wasn't acting anything like she would have expected. She was now watching herself place her hands over her ears and make a pouting face, one which she believed looked completely out of place. Nya. Naruto-sama, too many questions. You're confusing me. At that moment everything stopped. Yujito simply stared at her summon, while Naruto likely had an expression much like her own. Even Kitsune appeared to be thrown for a loop, as the look of complete shock on her face gave away whatever she had been thinking. Ah, much better. Nibi nodded and smiled as she spoke, still staring at Naruto, and held up a single finger. Now, Naruto-sama, one question at a time. Naruto's jaw moved for a moment, but no sound came out. Finally he let out a little laugh and returned the Nibi's smile. Why are you calling me Naruto-sama? Just Naruto is fine. The Nibi shook her head adamantly. I know all about what you did, and this is my way of expressing my thanks, Naya. Besides that, when I felt a bit of your chakra inside the seal, it felt warm, just like father's was. The room went silent again. Naruto appeared a little confused, but Yujito and Kitsune were both staring at him. Could it really be as Nibi said? Everyone knew that the Rakudo Sennin created the Biju, and if Nibi claimed his chakra felt a little bit familiar. Her train of thought was derailed as Kitsune began speaking. What Nibi says is the truth, Naruto. I can't believe I didn't notice it before now, but that's likely because I've been sealed in you and your kin for so long I never thought to dash. Kitsune was cut off by Nibi, still looking like Yujito, as the other Biju crashed into her with a big hug. Kyubionisima. Kyubionisima. Yujito didn't know if she could tolerate any more shock to her system today. She was already a nervous wreck about using Naruto's seal, and now each new revelation was like a jolt to her system. Naruto didn't seem to be faring much better, as his mouth was left hanging open as he watched the Nibi as Yujito completely glomp Kitsune. Onisama. Kitsune's voice was slightly muffled because of the cheering Nibi, and the fact that Yujito was slightly taller than Kitsune, so her clone body was causing Kitsune to talk against her shoulder. After the muffled question, Nibi pulled back to look curiously at her elder sister. Of course you are, Nyan. But you were created before me. Therefore wouldn't you be considered older? Yujito watched as her face adopted that same pouty expression again. Who cares, Naya? I was created second, but I got the impression from Tsunade that you would be the strongest and smartest of us all. Therefore I can look up to you. Besides. Nibi's expression turned sour. I don't want Ichibi and II to be the oldest. He's insane. As everyone slowly digested the information, Nibi looked around the room, and her eyes finally settled on her container. Letting out another squeal, Nibi promptly jumped forward and caught Yujito in a large hug. Yujito-chan. I finally get to see you from out here, Naya. The blonde woman slowly returned the hug as her shock at the current situation slowly disappeared. The Nibi that she talked to on a semi-regular basis was energetic, but not quite this, eccentric. Hi there, Nibi. Are you okay? Did the seal work properly? Her clone hopped back a step and gave her a smile and a nod, thumping a fist against her chest. Yep. It's a little strange, but I'm quickly getting used to it. Oh yeah. Nibi turned to face Naruto next, and he involuntarily took a step backwards. He needn't have bothered, however, since the Biju promptly flew forward and crashed into him. Since he was standing near a wall, this caused his back to be pressed up against it, and he was sandwiched between it and the Nibi. The blonde teen froze completely as he found the surprisingly soft but cold lips of the clone pressed up against his for a few seconds. He made no further movements either as it slowly backed away, giving him what appeared to be a coy smile. Did I do that right, Naya? When no one responded, the clone looked around between everyone in the room. Two of them had expressions of shock, but the third was simply looking agitated. Kitsune had her eyes narrowed as she looked at the Nibi, who still held Yujito's appearance. Why did you do that? Nibi's head tilted slightly to the side as she looked at Kitsune. I wanted to thank him for the seal that lets me be out here, Naya. Isn't that how you thank a human that you think is cute? Before Naruto or Yujito could say anything, Kitsune took the initiative. How can you say he's cute? He's a human, how can you possibly? As her voice trailed off, Nibi laughed lightly and shrugged. Yujito-chan thought he was pretty handsome, and I agree. I've been in many different containers over the long years and I think like a human now. I've also been sealed a lot longer than you, Onisama. That's why, being in this form with a body that can feel and touch, even if it is muffled. Nibi let out a long sigh, it's like a dream come true. Kitsune snarled, surprising everyone in the room, and then promptly dispelled in a large burst of red smoke. Naruto was more surprised by this action than anything else. As he turned to look at the remaining two occupants, he saw Yujito seem just as shocked as he was, while Nibi was beginning to look upset. I guess I shouldn't have done that, Naya. Naruto couldn't really do more than slowly shake his head and shrug. I guess not. I don't know what that was about, really. She seemed pretty upset. I don't know, Naruto scratched at the back of his head, looking at the spot where Kitsune had dispelled. She has told me more than once in the past that she doesn't have human emotions, but she knows how to emulate them. She's been acting a little different lately, but I thought she was just getting used to interacting with other people, humans. He saw two identical faces staring at him with frowns, but slowly the one who he knew was the Nibi began shaking her head slowly. Poor Onisama. She was on her own for so long she probably doesn't know or understand. All Biju were once human. We were the original Jinchuriki, Naya. There was a burst of smoke before the two shinobi could get a word in, though both of them seemed to be too stunned to say anything, regardless. As the smoke began to clear, a person flew out of the cloud and wrapped their arms around Naruto's waist. The force of impact wasn't much, but it was enough to force Naruto to take a step backward to maintain his balance. Naruto-sama. Naruto looked down to see a small girl with black hair and deep blue eyes, probably somewhere between 10 to 12 that had wrapped her arms around him, and was looking up at his face with a big smile. Naruto had to admit to himself that she looked cute, but the way tufts of her hair stood up at two distinct points on her head made his lips twitch upwards in amusement before he could return the greeting. You Nibi. The small girl holding him let out the kind of sigh that belied the age her appearance gave her. I know what you want to ask. All I remember is that this is what my body looked like before the Rikudo Sennin sealed part of the power he contained within me. Or, well, the Nibi was quiet for a moment as she released Naruto, and appeared to be thinking hard about something. That's not completely accurate. I faintly remember looking down at my body, and feeling strong. Really, really strong. Father told us some things, gave us instructions too. I don't remember anything else until later, when I woke up in a strange forest that I didn't recognize. I don't know anything about my life before I became this way. I just knew that it was my body that I saw a long time ago. It was kind of far away, so I may have been bigger than this, but being this small is kind of fun too. During the Nibi's explanation, Yujito managed to back herself over to a chair and literally fell into it. Naruto was too transfixed on what the Nibi was telling him to move an inch. The Biju were actually human once. Or rather, it seemed as though part of a power that the Rikudo Sennin had was sealed into 9 different humans. Apparently there needed to be some kind of container, or focus when the power was split from the Jubi, something to keep the power apart. But he didn't understand what she meant when she claimed to have seen her body. I tried to find father again, Naya, but I couldn't. I did find some others that I didn't recognize, and they started to attack me, so I ran. After that, my memories start getting fuzzier until the day I was sealed. I'm sorry. Both the Nibi and Yujito looked at Naruto sharply once he issued his apology. Why are you sorry, Naruto-sama? The teen shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable under the scrutiny. He wasn't completely sure about why he said sorry, he just felt it needed to be said. Kitsune said she had an eidetic memory, but since she was apparently the last of the Biju, whatever the Rikudo Sennin did to create them, he had perfected the process by the time he got to Kyubi. I'm sorry that you became a Biju, that you got sealed, everything. The little girl version of the Nibi gave him a beaming smile and hugged him again, but this time he expected it and even returned it slightly. Naruto could have sworn he heard some kind of purring noise come from the girl, but decided against questioning it. There were already enough things to wonder about for one day. I'm fine. Father was nice, I don't think he would have made me a Biju if I didn't want to be. Suddenly the girl separated herself from Naruto and whirled around, facing Yujito. Yujito-ne, let's go to a park, Naya. I've always wanted to try one of those swingy things. While Yujito was obviously stumped, she was still smiling slightly, as if the mental image of a Biju using a swing set was amusing to her. Instead of immediately replying to the Nibi, however, she looked towards the other blonde in the room. Sorry to bother you, Naruto, but where is the nearest park? It's not far. I can take you, thanks. By the way, how long is this going to last? It depends on how much chakra you put into the seal, but in case there was a problem I made it so that this one will only last for up to 2 hours. Yujito nodded and sighed, brushing loose hairs away from her face as she returned to her feet. This should be interesting. Nibi, who had been looking back and forth between them curiously as they talked about her, promptly pumped a fist into the air. You bet, Naya. For the first time in Naruto's recent memory, Yujito laughed, even if it did sound forced. Almost 4 months later, I'm home. Naruto yelled down the hall, letting Kitsune know he was back, just in case she was home too. It had been a bit of an adjustment, living with someone else, even if that someone else wasn't completely human. It all began shortly after Yujito and the Nibi, who wanted to be called Nico from now on, just like her Fonisima, left to return to Kumo. Both Yujito and Nico had planted one on each of his cheeks at the same time, thanking him profusely for what he did. They were both sure Killer Bee would be very excited to try as well. Meanwhile, Kitsune had watched and tried to remain detached from the whole thing, especially whenever Nico got clingy or called him Naruto-sama. Kitsune didn't seem surprised to find out that she was once human, or at least that her mind was. Much like Nico, she remembered everything from the moment she woke up in the forest, but their big difference was that she didn't remember a single thing that came before, other than her first and only discussion with their father. She also had what felt like imprinted instructions in her mind to avoid human civilization unless she needed information about current goings-on. Nico didn't have that imprint. After their departure, it became obvious even to the normally oblivious Naruto that Kitsune was trying much harder to act human than she had before. Even when he brought it up to her that he had noticed, she had simply stated that since she was likely human before she became a Biju, it only made sense for her to act the way she was. He didn't think it did, but knew better than to argue. Welcome back. Snapping from his brief reverie, he turned to look down the hall after depositing his sandals by the door. Opening his mouth to ask about her day, it quickly snapped shut when he saw what she was, or rather wasn't wearing. The first thing he noticed, actually, was that her hair was down. She never wore it down anymore, it was usually always up in a ponytail. Secondly, he noticed that she filled out that large t-shirt, black with an orange leaf symbol over her chest, in all the right places. Lastly, he noticed that she wasn't wearing any pants. The shirt she had on was long enough to cover her down to about mid-thigh, but otherwise left little to the imagination. "Haven't I told you about keeping your mouth closed unless you plan on catching something in it?" He hadn't known his jaw had dropped, so he immediately closed it, causing a click noise to reverberate through his head. At first he was embarrassed, to be caught staring so blatantly. But the smirk that was on her face told him that he did exactly as she expected. Since she wasn't scowling, his response was also likely the correct one. Her hands moved to her hips, and Naruto found himself strangely transfixed to the movement, and noticed especially how the shirt was hiked up a tiny bit when her fingers pressed the cloth against her skin. Didn't her legs ever end? "Ah, nice shirt." Kitsune replied immediately, without missing a beat, "Why thank you. I just bought it while you were out training yesterday." Naruto nodded slowly, and had to mentally force himself to look away. Swallowing deeply, he tried to pretend that he was straightening out his sandals by the door. He knew that Kitsune likely saw right through what he was doing right now, but for some reason he didn't care. He didn't deal with embarrassment well. Luckily he was saved from further embarrassment when Kitsune moved back in the direction from which she arrived, the kitchen. His apartment only had 3 rooms, so over the last few months of living together he at least thought he had gotten used to seeing Kitsune in various states of undress, all of which were completely unintentional. Or, well, at least it was unintentional on his part. Even if he knew now that he was oblivious about things regarding women in the past, living with Kitsune had, if anything, made him hyper-aware. He had never known her to do anything without a purpose behind it, and every time he had encountered her, she had just stared at him, as if waiting for what he would do. She cared more for his reaction than the fact that he had almost seen her nude more than once. Well, technically it was still his body, or at least a shell of one created with chakra that she occupied and molded to look the way she wanted, or so he thought. Naruto tiredly rubbed his hands over his face. It was getting too complicated to really think about. What happened just a few minutes ago, however, that was completely new. This was the first time she had done something so blatant. The redhead had also started buying clothes about 2 or 3 weeks ago, mostly normal outfits, but it was the first things she bought that weren't classified as tools or food. While clothing in general was something recent, this oversized shirt was something new and bold for her. Almost as a side note, Naruto wondered where she stored her clothes. Whenever she dispelled, whatever she was wearing or holding somehow went with her. He hadn't been to visit her in his mindscape since, well, it had probably been close to a year, since they fought Orochimaru. He could have visited the empty cage, he mused, but since it was likely empty of anything but chakra, there wasn't really a point. Perhaps all of her acquisitions were somehow sealed as well. That was likely the case, since he rarely ever saw any of her clothes lying about. Maybe it would be worth it to go take a look around. Naruto promptly snapped from his musings. The blonde realized he was standing still in the hallway, staring at his feet as he thought about things. Quickly looking up, he noticed Kitsune was leaning halfway out of the doorway to the kitchen area, a puzzled yet slightly amused look on her face. "Huh." Kitsune let out a brief noise that sounded very close to a giggle. "Huh, is all you can say? I was waiting for you in here. Or is the floor really that interesting?" Trying desperately not to blush again, Naruto shook his head. "No, it isn't. I was just thinking about how much things have changed." "Oh." Kitsune sounded genuinely curious, and stepped out from the doorway into the hall again. "Care to elaborate?" He initially thought of trying to distract her so he wouldn't have to answer the question, but that rarely if ever worked, so he figured the truth was the best bet. If he was lucky, she wouldn't maim him. "I was just thinking about how you've started buying clothes and wearing things I'd never thought you would ever wear. Like this?" Kitsune made a small show of pulling at the lower hem of her oversized shirt for a moment, briefly accentuating her upper body assets. Naruto had a difficult time keeping his focus on her face, which of course she knew, if the absolutely feral grin on her face was any indication. Apparently today was a lucky day, and he would not be killed. "Yeah, like no. I mean you're wearing real clothes now, not just transformed ones." Naruto cleared his throat and tried to walk around the redhead as he moved towards the kitchen, only for her to shift over and stand in front of him. He wasn't sure if he had grown or if she had purposefully changed her height to be shorter than him, but he was now easily a few inches taller than her now. As a result, he was able to get a good unintentional look down the loose-fitting neck of her shirt as she blocked his path, and he nearly collided with her. Trying to get away? No. I was just going to the kitchen, like you asked. Without me? That's not very nice. Naruto's mouth opened and closed like a fish a few times as he simply stared incredulously at his companion. She had been smiling a lot more lately, and while that was good and all, if her smile now got any wider it would start to look menacing rather than happy. He sighed and let his head droop, careful to close his eyes so that he didn't get another eyeful, even if Kitsune was being uncharacteristically cooperative on that front. Okay, Kitsune, what's going on? Whatever do you mean? Naruto shook his head, keeping his eyes closed, but still gestured at her with his hand. You never act like this, not that I'm complaining, so you like it then? Naruto was trying to delay opening his eyes for as long as possible, this way he could think about the situation without being distracted. His mind was desperately trying to come up with an appropriate answer, but was drawing blanks. Of course he liked it, what hot-blooded teenage male wouldn't? Just finding a good way to say it was the problem, he'd had too many close encounters with Sakura too. Suddenly, he realized that Kitsune wasn't Sakura, and he seemed to have been unconsciously molding everything he thought about women around his teammate. Deciding to take a chance, even if it was Kitsune, he'd tell her what he thought. The moment he opened his eyes to say something, he immediately stopped as he realized Kitsune had moved her face to be looking directly up into his. There was barely a handful of centimeters between them. He stopped breathing as he became hyper-aware of their closeness, and time itself felt like it slowed down as he examined her facial features. Her eyes were half-lidded, though it was still easy enough to see her bright red irises and black slitted pupils. A few loose strands of dark red hair were loose across the front of her face, and he followed them down from her eyes, past the dainty nose, to see her lips. They glistened slightly, he noticed. Slightly pink, not very puffy or pouty or any of those other words he'd read that were used to describe models' lips when he was trying to come up with the best look for his female form. They were just her. Finding himself surprisingly short on words, he decided to take a gamble and go for it. Leaning forward and moving down slightly, he let his eyes drift closed and pressed his lips against hers. They were surprisingly soft and warm, though he wasn't sure what to expect considering he wasn't exactly kissing a human, but it did immediately register that it was nothing like when Nico kissed him. Any further thoughts were fleeting, however, as Kitsune almost immediately began pressing her lips back against his own. Naruto's hands began to move on their own, moving forward a bit to settle on her slender hips. Her own hands had since come up and began fisting in his hair as he felt her lips open against his. A wet tongue began flicking against his mouth as if teasing, asking for entry. He began to comply, only for Kitsune's hands to leave his head and quickly move down to his shoulders, then push him back and away from her. The blonde stood there, staring at a wide-eyed Kitsune, and noticed that both of them were breathing heavily. Her skin had taken on a reddish hue, and a more knowledgeable part of his brain that was still working realized that she was actually flushed. Something else in his brain clicked, realizing that it wasn't possible for clones to blush because they didn't have blood, but it was immediately pushed to the side in favor of more pressing matters. Kitsune. Before he could say what his mind was thinking, the flustered-looking redhead promptly dispelled in a flash of dull, reddish-hued smoke. As Naruto stood there and continued to stare at the spot where Kitsune had just dispelled from, he began to rub his forehead as he realized that things may have just gotten very complicated. 3 weeks later. Are you okay, Kitsune? The redhead nodded, almost listlessly, as she placed another of many patient files in its appropriate spot. I believe so. Why? Her friend, she supposed, looked at her with bright green eyes, the corners of her mouth ever so slightly twitching down. You've been awfully quiet this past week. Normally you're asking all kinds of questions. Placing the last file where it belonged, she closed the cabinet drawer and turned to face her pink-haired companion. Sakura was right, normally she was the one hunting the other girl down within the hospital, acting as little more than a gopher and glorified messenger, throwing in occasional questions about life too. When she wasn't on a mission, that is. Sakura wasn't the only one she asked questions to, of course. The other girls, and even occasionally boys, got their fair share. There were some she enjoyed talking with or listening to more than others as well, which only fueled her understanding that each human was in fact very different. She knew Sakura tolerated her presence, and they had perhaps at best a tenuous friendship. Strangely enough, they had only really started warming up to each other this last week, while Naruto was away at Mount Mayaboku, doing training to become a sage, supposedly. Naruto wanted her there, but the frogs didn't in case she proved to be a distraction. She was inclined to agree, barely, if only because Jiraiya losing his arm while investigating Rain Country would be enough of a distraction to Naruto. As for the others she had chatted with, she tried to avoid Ino and Kiba. Ino would talk non-stop, even if she didn't really care what the human girl was talking about. Kiba on the other hand didn't really talk, but he smelled so oppressively of dog that it nearly overwhelmed her senses, and he kept staring at her whenever Naruto wasn't around. He probably thought she didn't notice, but she did. The new part of her emotions that she was discovering, or perhaps rediscovering, felt she should be flattered, but another part of her felt strangely dirty because it wasn't the person she wanted looking at her. Hinata wasn't much of a conversationalist, and tended to simply answer questions quickly and quietly. The only person she had ever noticed the other girl speaking to regularly was her Jounin sensei, Kurinai. The same could be said of her teammate Shino, though if possible he spoke even less. About the most she had gotten out of him to date was that his bugs didn't like to go anywhere near her, which suited her just fine. Choji was another that didn't really talk much either, unless it was to Shikamaru. As for the shadow user, if there ever was anyone who was the antithesis of Naruto, it was him. Lazy as could be, but incredibly brilliant. She started thinking about what Naruto might be like if he had Shikamaru's intelligence, but was interrupted when Sakura began talking to her again. It's about Naruto, isn't it? Kitsune's head whipped around so fast that Sakura thought she might have potentially broken her own neck. What made you come to that conclusion? Sakura was clearly smirking. Your reaction just now, for one. On the other hand, you've been getting quieter and quieter since he left to go train with the toads. I thought you could talk to each other in your heads. Kitsune stared at Sakura briefly, before frowning slightly and shifting her attention back to the files. They had been avoiding each other ever since their encounter. They would still talk about everyday, mundane things, but there was something wrong with her and she was trying to figure out what it was. Unfortunately he was called away before she could, and she realized that it was making her miserable. He's too far away. The further apart we are, the longer it takes our messages to reach the other. Even just across the village causes about a 5-minute delay. The delay grows exponentially with the distance, and it probably can't break into summon realms. I've been sending messages every day since he's been gone, and haven't gotten a reply yet. Sakura knew that Naruto wasn't the type of person who wouldn't reply to a message, especially from Kitsune, so she didn't even bother offering any what-if scenarios. Trying to think of something to say to cheer up the other woman, her thought process was interrupted as she heard a muffled booming noise and the floor under her feet shook slightly. Without a word, both Kitsune and Sakura jumped into action, rushing down to the lobby in preparation for any arrivals. Even though Kitsune wasn't qualified to heal, she was still perfectly capable of assisting with smaller tasks. Before they were halfway to their destination, however, there was another explosion that was closer this time. The floor lurched worse this time, and both of them could barely keep their balance. We're under attack. Sakura's exclamation went unneeded, as a staccato of booms followed. The explosions were brief but sounded like they were spread out all across the village. They were undoubtedly being attacked by someone. Kitsune quickly regained her footing and continued moving towards the lobby, only to have her wrist grabbed by Sakura, stopping her. The redhead glanced back and down at the other girl, who was down on one knee and looking up at her with a steely expression. Kitsune, can you warn Naruto? The redhead simply stared at the other girl for a moment with a deadpan expression, while listening to the rumbles in the background. I thought I already told you that I can't talk to him from this far away. Sakura bit her lower lip, and looked away for a moment before sighing and looking back up at the Biju again, her expression pained. What would happen if you released your summon? Kitsune pondered that for a moment. Honestly, she had never really considered it. There was no reason for her to release before, no matter how lonely she was without Naruto around. Not that she'd ever admit that to anyone, even Naruto himself. Oh sure, there were others in his age group that she had hung out with from time to time, but they were his friends first, not hers. Some of them probably looked to her as a friend now, but many of their more juvenile interests were not something that entertained her. Not that Naruto was the pinnacle of entertainment either, but the blonde was comfortable. Bringing thoughts back to their current situation, she sent a sharp look at the back of Sakura's head, who was now dragging her down the hallway. I don't know what will happen if I dispel, or how long it will take me to get back to Naruto. Since I am technically here through a summon technique, it should work in the same way, and I'll instantly appear back in the seal. Sakura had stopped pulling her along, and turned to look over her shoulder. Do you want to try? Is it too risky? Was it risky? Perhaps, anything unknown was technically a risk. It was risky for Naruto to summon her the first time over a year ago. But look what they had gained as a result. Naruto had given her a home, as strange as that thought was. She had always wandered for as long as she could remember until being sealed away. Now that Naruto had freed her as best he was able at the moment, others had given her many chances to be normal, she would take that risk. For his home. For their home. For her home. Sakura tripped slightly as the wrist she was holding suddenly disappeared with a soft popping noise. Turning around quickly, she noted the traces of reddish-hued smoke that was rapidly disappearing. Good luck, Kitsune. Hurry back, both of you. Age 16, Part 2. Approximately 45 minutes later, Naruto was staring at the inside of his hands, wondering where he was, and more importantly why his hands were covered in blood. Or maybe it was ink. It was too dark to tell. Exactly whose blood it was or where the ink came from didn't really concern him at the moment. All he knew was that he was in a lot of pain. It wasn't from the size of position he was currently seated in either. While it might have had something to do with it, the strong ache was too much for it to be just that. Do you think you understand pain? Considering how much it hurt right now, he was pretty sure he did. Nah, can why, me nar. Strange. There was another voice. It was muffled though. Hatred spreads too easily. Do you know of a way to stop the hatred? No, he didn't. If there was a way, he wasn't aware of it. All he was doing was minding his own business, training in the sage arts when he was suddenly recalled to Konoha because it was under attack. He had managed to get back in time to prevent the total destruction of the village, but the damage was obvious from where he appeared. Rubble and bodies littered the streets. Thanks to Sage Mode he was able to identify that most of his closest friends were safe, but some he couldn't detect at all. Kakashi. Shizune. Tsunade was fluctuating wildly. Naru, Lise, idiot, yo, up. The voice was back. Strange. Unfortunately the pain racking his body was only getting worse. He tried to focus on the voice that had spoken, but it was to no avail. Suddenly there was an intense burning in his gut, and looking down with dead eyes he noticed as the seal around his navel appeared to open and started bleeding in earnest. How do you plan to bring peace if you cannot stop hatred and pain? I don't know. Naruto shouted to no one. Throwing his head back, he groaned as more pain racked his body. It was quickly becoming unbearable, like red-hot irons pushing against his very soul as the rest of his mortal body was stripped away. His head tossing back and forth, Naruto scrunched up his eyes in an effort to keep the tears at bay. It may have seemed silly since no one was around to actually see him cry, but he still didn't want to. His life had been enough of an emotional roller coaster lately. Someone, anyone, tell me what to do. He groaned out. I'm so lost. Naruto. The feminine voice made him open his eyes, but it was a cool touch that grasped both of his hands which made him face forward and look at what was going on. The hands themselves were strong but gentle on his. They were attached to arms, which were in turn attached to a feminine body that was wearing an outfit he vaguely recalled seeing a while back. He tried to focus on where he remembered it from, but there was still too much pain for him to. The cool grasp moved from his hands to his head, as he felt fingers brush through his hair around his ears. With a soft jerking motion, his head was brought forward to look straight into another face. It was one that he faintly recognized, rather regal looking with red, arching eyebrows, a small nose and dainty lips that were currently tilted downwards in what appeared to be a worried frown. What he focused on the most, however, was the eyes. Bright red eyes with black crescent pupils that were staring back at him, trying to convey things he couldn't even begin to fathom in his current state. Naruto. Open your heart to me. Let me take away your pain. He thought he understood what her loud, forceful voice was saying, but it wasn't until her eyes flashed. The moment they did, he took a deep, gasping breath before shuddering from head to toe. With a deep groan, he opened and closed his eyes a few times, then inhaled once again. Kitsune. The name came as both a question and a statement in a breathy whisper. Naruto. Can you understand me now? If the blonde was at all surprised by the concern in her voice, he didn't show it. Why yeah. I think so. What's going on? The last thing I clearly remember, was Hinata. Kitsune snorted. You saved the village from complete destruction and managed to lure pain away so he didn't destroy it completely. The girl should have remained back like everyone else and not follow you and Pain into the forest. When she claimed to love you and then was stabbed, it triggered your rage. You stopped listening to me and all I could feel from you was kill, kill, kill. The chastisement did what Kitsune intended, and a look of guilt clearly flashed upon Naruto's face. That doesn't matter anymore though. What does matter is that my power is running rampant in your body because you're not there to guide it, and I'm stuck here behind the seal. My chakra is simply following your last impulse, to try to kill Pain. But from what I can tell it isn't having much luck without guidance. If you don't wake up soon, we'll be captured. Kitsune finally released his head and leaned back slightly. Are you ready? I've separated your consciousness so that you could talk to me and wouldn't suffer from the pain your body is feeling. The blonde went wide-eyed for a moment before managing to choke out, I don't know if I'm ready. He looked away, avoiding what he knew was most likely disappointment in Kitsune's eyes. Why not? Naruto wasn't sure he heard her correctly, but he must have because when he did finally manage to work up the courage to look at her again, she was staring at him with what he interpreted as passive curiosity. She was sitting down in the now clear shallow water around them. Looking down at himself he noticed that the seal around his navel still looked like it was open, but his hands and clothes were somehow no longer drenched in the bloody ink. It was hard to focus on anything beyond the immediate area, the only lighting was rather faint and it was centered around the two of them. There was too much darkness and visibility dropped off sharply beyond a couple feet from where they were located. Looking at the redhead sitting across from him, he realized that he still owed her an answer. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath before starting. I know you're slowly learning about emotions, well, lately mine have been all over the place. I think it began right about the time we shared that kiss. Naruto glanced at her once again to see what kind of reaction she would have, but other than a slight raise of an eyebrow, the redhead said nothing. He groaned internally about how she could remain so detached about what was generally considered an intimate gesture. Instead of saying anything to him, she simply motioned with her hand for him to continue. I was torn up and didn't know what to do when you disappeared, and then the next time I summoned you it was as if nothing had happened. Did you like it? Did you not? Were you just as confused as I was? When I tried to ask, the subject was changed. The second time I asked I thought you were getting angry so I didn't try again. Naruto shifted his position out of the seiza as he talked, and into something more comfortable, sitting cross-legged on the ground. His hands idly played with the shallow water which came up to about mid-thigh. In a rather short string of events after that, I nearly lost my godfather Jiraiya, then I was dragged off to train in the sage arts, only to be brought back early because my home was under attack by Akatsuki. I get back to see buildings destroyed all over, and while I'm fighting one of my friends tells me she loves me, only to get stabbed. Now, here I am. In the middle of this pain is telling me he wants to bring peace by using all the Biju as a peacekeeping force, and when I tell him that's the wrong way to go about it he asks me if I know a better way. I don't, Naruto moaned, rubbing his forehead, but it's not exactly like I've had time to think about it either. Pain doesn't seem willing to sit around while I come up with an answer. Kitsune nodded and let out a humming noise. Then you need to defeat him to give yourself the time you need. But how? Naruto questioned, obviously exasperated. I've been using Sage mode and he's still winning. You've only really known how to use it for a couple days at most, right? I don't know what you were expecting. Naruto let out a sigh as he covered his face with his hands. There is something else we can do. Kitsune ventured. I don't know how well it would work though. You know something I can do. He immediately removed his hands, and began to stare at the Biju expectantly. Yes, though like I said, I don't know how well it would work. It might be risky to do it now, and, well, Kitsune turned her head to look over her shoulder at something he couldn't see. I don't know if you trust me enough to try. I trust you. Kitsune immediately turned her head back to Naruto, obviously surprised. Why you do? But dash, I've known you for over half my life. With how much you've helped me so far, I trust you more than anyone else. If the redhead had to be honest with herself, she wasn't too sure what to think at the moment. Kitsune felt, well, she wasn't entirely sure what it was she was feeling. It felt good, though, and that was probably all that really mattered. Preparing herself for immediate rejection, she offered the only way out of this explanation that she could think of. You need to open the seal. Naruto simply stared at her for a moment. After several moments of staring at each other, Kitsune was about ready to call the idea a bust, however. Alright. She was shocked, and it must have shown because he did one of his silly, I bet I just surprised you, didn't I, lopsided grins that both amused and annoyed her. If you're sure, Kitsune began. The sooner we get it open, the better. When you first got here you were at 6 tails. I think now you're at about 8. Naruto looked slightly panicked. Jumping up and making a splash, he began looking around. We should hurry then. Where are we anyway? Right outside the seal. I just had to isolate your consciousness to be able to talk to you away from the pain. When I release it, this form of mine will probably disappear like last time. So you'll have to make it to the seal on your own. You'll probably be in pain again, too. The blonde looked a little queasy at that thought, but slowly nodded his head regardless. Smiling grimly, Kitsune climbed to her feet and moved closer to him, before reaching up and grabbing the sides of his head again. I'm going to release your consciousness. Are you ready, as I'll ever be? Let's do this. Kitsune closed her eyes, concentrating, and Naruto felt as if a large weight settled on his shoulders. Right after that the burning sensation started throughout his body again, but it didn't feel nearly as painful as before. From the look on your face, you're wondering why it doesn't hurt as much as before. Yeah. It was Kitsune's turn to grin as she removed her hands from the side of his head again. My power was consuming you from the inside out as you were losing control. Now that you're focused again, it will stop. Not really knowing what to say to something like that, Naruto nodded before looking around again. They were in the room with the seal, and he could see it clear as day. Naruto. I should warn you that there may be some backlash, especially since you don't have the key. We'll be forcing the lock so I don't know what will happen. I do have the key, actually, the toads gave it to me while I was training. The toad sage had a vision that I would need it soon. It looks like he was right. Kitsune's avatar was simply staring at him incredulously. She didn't say anything further either as he jumped, lifting up into the air at a sort of slow glide towards where the seal was located. As he approached, he realized that the lock was much bigger than it looked. It was nearly the size of his torso. With a grunt of exertion, he tugged at the top of the seal and started to pull down, completely ripping the seal off. Letting the overly large piece of paper flutter to the ground below him, the blonde inspected the spiral-shaped lock that was behind it. It was definitely a lot more complex than just the spiral that was facing him, but somehow he seemed to know just what to do to unlock it properly. He likely had the key to thank for that. Making a claw shape with his right hand, he began to move it towards his navel, only for someone to grab his wrist, halting any further movement. Wadash, are you sure you want to do that, Naruto? The voice was one he didn't immediately recognize. Following the arm attached to the hand, the first thing his eyes focused on was the white coat. After that, the gaze quickly shifted up, settling on a mature man with sharp features, clear blue eyes, and spiky blonde hair. It only took him a second to identify who it was. His picture was plastered in every academy textbook that mentioned the Third War. Contrary to popular belief, he did open his books from time to time when he was in school. Dad? How? Minato graced his son with a small smile. Hey, Naruto. Releasing his son's wrist, he moved his hand over to the teen's shoulder, slowly but deliberately leading him away from the seal. The older blonde glanced down at the redhead who was still visible and looking up at them. Closing his eyes for a moment, he lifted his free hand and snapped his fingers. Naruto and Kitsune both took an involuntary step back as the area immediately shifted from in front of the large cage to a vast expanse of whiteness. Not only that, but whereas Kitsune had been rather far below them before, she was now directly across from the both of them. I brought us all here so that we could talk without any distractions at all. The yondaime glanced over at the redhead. Kitsune, I'm using my chakra to keep your form stable so you don't disappear in the middle of the conversation. While Kitsune was staring at the man rather warily, Naruto was beginning to get worked up. Dad! Dad! I thought you were dead. How did you get here? While Minato looked happy, he couldn't stop a small frown off of his face. I am dead, Naruto. I put what was left of my chakra in the seal, so that I could perform an emergency sealing again, if it was needed. I only exist as spiritual energy right now, so once I've done what I have to do I'll be gone forever. I don't have a physical part to help me regenerate anymore. I'm sorry. Naruto couldn't help but feel tears prickle at the corner of his eyes. Instead of outright crying he merely sniffled, then wiped at his eyes. So why are you here now, then? Glancing back and forth between the other two, Minato gestured at Kitsune. I put myself here as a failsafe in case Kitsune was still acting like the Kyuubi that everyone knew and was going to try to take over when you were weak. Kitsune was staring intensely at the man as he turned to her. But, it seems like the Kyuubi that I once knew no longer exists. Or maybe never really did for that matter. With a shake of his head and a small smile, the yondaime Hokage remnant leaned forward into a slight bow. For what it's worth, Kitsune, I'm sorry for sealing you away again. I've been watching you interact with my son for a long time, and while part of me is guilty, another part is glad I did. Thank you for helping him when he needed it the most. Both Naruto and Kitsune were obviously stunned, though Naruto was the first to manage to pull himself out of the short-lived stupor. As Minato stood back up straight again, Kitsune shot a quick glance at the younger blonde before nodding and even returning a bit of a bow, though hers was much more rigid. I am also sorry for taking your lives early. Otherwise. Kitsune's mouth opened and closed a few times, obviously at a loss. Minato simply grinned. In a situation like this it is okay to say thank you. I'm thanking you for your apology, though it is not necessary. Kushina and I were both going to die anyway. You simply cut short what was inevitable. Thank you. Kitsune looked away and hugged herself, definitely uncomfortable with the entire situation. Chuckling, Minato turned back to his son. Naruto, I'm sorry the way things turned out. I wish your mother or I could have been there for you, but things happened so fast there wasn't really any time for planning. Naruto nodded slowly, but frowned. What did happen, anyway? Other than when she first explained it, Kitsune never really wants to talk about it. When the mentioned Biju shot him a sharp glance, he immediately backtracked. I don't blame her for anything, of course. It was a pretty bad night. Unfortunately, I don't have the amount of chakra I'd need to explain, not if I'm going to fix your seal. What? Naruto exclaimed. Why would you want to fix the seal? Because no matter what the intentions are, it's best to practice working with Kitsune under more controlled circumstances. Besides that, I sealed away what was left of your mother's chakra too, so she'll appear when that time finally comes. Mom is here too. Awesome. Naruto couldn't help but cheer. It was contagious too as Minato laughed lightly, and even Kitsune's lips twitched upwards a bit. Yes, she is. She'll be able to explain things to you and probably talk to you a lot as well, especially since she still had a lot of chakra left. Naruto blinked, for some reason hearing that made a new idea randomly appear in his head. Hey, Dad, could I take yours and Mom's chakra and put it into a shadow clone, like I've been doing with Kitsune? While the redhead once again gave him a sharp glance, Minato simply gave him a faint smile. You could, but unfortunately I don't have the chakra left to last very long, and like I said before, my chakra won't regenerate because I don't have a physical body. I'm just here to fix the seal. Sorry, again. Naruto let his head droop as he sighed. Now your mother, she might have some ideas. She was the genius at sealing, anyway. I'm sure between her and Kitsune they might be able to think of something. Her original purpose was to teach you how to use the Kyuubi's power, but since I think Kitsune will be more than willing. Minato trailed off, casting a glance at the redhead nearby, who was ignoring him and staring at the once again excited Naruto. Anyway, you can check with your mother when the time comes. Now, before I have too little chakra left, you know what you need to do. I need to beat pain, but nothing I'm doing is working. Oh, it's working, Minato affirmed. Remember, everyone other than perhaps Jinchuriki run out of power sometime. As long as you can keep yourself out of pain's grasp, he'll eventually run out of chakra. That's when you move in to stop him. Are you sure? He just seems like he can keep going on forever. His father chuckled. Trust me. I've even seen Sarutobi-sama and Jiraiya-sensei run out of chakra. Even if he doesn't for some reason, you're my son. I believe that you can handle him, and find that path to peace you're looking for. Naruto couldn't help but grin as his father placed a hand on his head and rubbed it, gently. Now, Minato started, getting serious once again, I'm going to fix the seal. You'd better make a plan fast, because it won't be long before you wake up on the outside when I'm done. Got it? I think I have a plan already. It will just be a bit tricky to pull off. Good. Here goes nothing. Pulling up the sleeve on his right arm, Minato made a quick one-handed sign, then put his hand into a claw shape like Naruto had done earlier. Moving his fingers so they hovered above the runic script, he quickly turned his wrist in a counterclockwise direction, closing the loosened seal. Almost immediately, Minato began to fade, as did Kitsune. He almost panicked before remembering that it was his father's chakra that was enabling Kitsune to even be there with them at the time. Naruto, continue with your shinobi way and doing what you believe in. I have faith you'll find the answer to your problem soon. I love you. Before Naruto could say anything in response, his father turned to look at Kitsune, who now simply had a rather blank look on her face. Kitsune, thank you for everything. It may be a selfish request on my part, but please be with Naruto as long as you can. I think you're both good for each other. Looking back to his son again, Minato waved, then disappeared in a brief flash of light. Naruto was a little disappointed that he didn't get to say a proper goodbye, but didn't have a chance to dwell on it as Kitsune disappeared right after. The place he was located in began to change to black and get darker until he couldn't see his hand in front of his face anymore. The moment he blinked, however, he woke back up in the real world outside of his mind. He was standing upside down on what appeared to be a very large rock that was hovering in the sky. Holy shit, now is not the time to be shocked, Naruto. Pain has the powers of the Sage of Six Paths, as you know. One of the old man's abilities was to use gravity manipulation to form large objects. Really? Oh man, that sounds awesome. I'm sure our opinions on the matter will differ. Anyway, summon me. I have a plan. Naruto, I won't do it. What? Why not? You need me out there. No, I don't. I can do this. Dad believes in me. I won't let him or anyone else down. I don't want Pain knowing that I can summon you, either. Again, I ask why not. Because I know there are ways to keep summons from returning to the summon realm. Pain also has one of those guys that can pull souls out of bodies. I don't want that to happen to you, Naruto. You don't need to say anything. I'll protect you until the day I die. That's a promise. Kitsune didn't reply after that, and Naruto knew he was standing still long enough to be able to wrap some natural chakra around himself. He could literally feel himself relax as the chakra settled around his own, buffering and boosting his own considerable skills. Looking down as the smoke finally began to clear around him, he spotted Pain on the ground below, staring right back up. What do you need me to do? The blonde almost jumped, but managed to contain it to a twitch. He wasn't expecting Kitsune to talk again, let alone offer to help him directly however he wanted it. I have an idea. I think I can get him, but I have 2, maybe 3 shots before I run out of natural chakra. Your chakra didn't like it before when the toads tried to merge with me to help me generate natural chakra. Do you think you can do it? My original form was that of a force of nature. What do you think? Then can you please generate natural chakra for me while I'm fighting him? As long as I have enough, I'm sure I can finish this fight really fast. Very well. Ready when you are. A feral grin appeared on Naruto's face. With Kitsune helping him now, this was going to be easy. Almost too easy. 3 days later, Kitsune tilted her head to the side slightly as she examined the kitchen of their new apartment, trying to make it more livable. While she wasn't 100% certain of the best ways to decorate, having spent plenty of time with the other female humans of Naruto's generation, she had a plethora of good ideas. It felt nice to use her eidetic memory to do something constructive, for a change. Actually, doing something constructive in general brought quite a few sensations to the fore that she didn't really ever recall experiencing previously. The main one was satisfaction, or that's what Naruto believed it was. Then again, the last couple days since the attack, she had been feeling plenty of new yet familiar emotions. Satisfaction, having decorated their new apartment. Knowing that effort was put into the creation of something, and then seeing it complete made her feel happy. She got a new appreciation for why humans fought so hard for things they owned. Anger, while it was something that she was already familiar with, Naruto knocked over the table and plant near the entrance to demonstrate what satisfaction was by ruining something she had created. He used one emotion to explain another, which she believed was rather clever, for him, anyway. Content, watching Naruto sleep and feeling that all was right with the world, at least for a few fleeting moments. As a chakra construct inhabiting a clone, she didn't ever really sleep. It was mostly meditation for the purpose of accelerated chakra regeneration. Lately she had taken to slipping into bed with him after he had fallen asleep to watch him more closely. Embarrassment, she'd never tell him she slipped into his bed after he fell asleep. Not for a long time, if she could help it. Jealousy, being so close to Naruto during the fight with Pain, now she had hardly seen much of him at all over the last 3 days because he was helping out all over the village doing repairs. By the time he returned to their home he was always tired and they barely had any time to talk before he was falling asleep. The redhead sighed as she sat down on the couch in their new guest room. They had to get a new one as the old building Naruto lived in had been mostly destroyed by Pain's attack. It was the same over quite a lot of the village. Many people had set up camps outside the walls as the interior was reconstructed. While the damage was great, they were lucky that it was mostly consolidated in specific areas instead of widespread. Their new apartment was one that had been built within the last 2 years on part of the old Uchiha property which had been auctioned off. The owner had offered Naruto a place to stay, free of charge, as thanks for saving the village. At first the blonde was hesitant to accept anything for free, not sure what to think. But when other offers for free items, from houses to clothing to weapons to food, began coming in, he graciously accepted the apartment and turned away everything else. A small smile grew on her face when she recalled once again that the owner had pegged her as Naruto's girlfriend, sending the blonde into an apologetic fit, trying to claim that he didn't really know if that's what they were. When she didn't try to refute what the owner had said, Naruto simply stared at her for a while, as if he wasn't sure why she wasn't disagreeing. The only thing she was really feeling at the time was amusement, though she couldn't really place her finger on exactly why. In regards to her jealousy, Kitsune had come to understand over time that she was rather possessive. While she had never really considered herself to be very territorial, when she got angry and nearly attacked the blonde after he knocked over the table and plant the other day, he had to quickly explain what it meant before she had a chance to harm him. Calming down as she listened, he explained several things she vaguely remembered, but the redhead unfortunately had no way to identify the feelings behind them. There was one thing that was very clear in her mind, though. Naruto was hers. The explanations of possessiveness, jealousy, contentedness, they all finally made sense when put into that one particular context. She had been with him since birth. He had given her freedom and wanted her as a friend, rather than as a source of power. He treated her as a partner during their fight with Pain. He wanted to protect her, which was something that had only ever happened to her one time before, when she was created. It was the feeling that the Sage of Six Paths had left her with, the idea that if she hid she would be protected. Naruto was home to her, in the most pure sense. More than a physical place, she felt comforted by his mere presence. With startling clarity the redhead understood that she wasn't thinking about him as a mere human anymore, but there was no denying that they weren't of the same species. As a chakra construct, she could do things with her power that many humans could only dream of, but at the same time it limited her to something she found herself starting to understand and want. A relationship. When working in the hospital, she had found the Hokage's first apprentice, Shizune, to be a very patient and understanding individual. The dark-haired woman had taken quite a lot of time out of her busy schedule to explain all the emotions Kitsune had been feeling, particularly the ones towards Naruto. It was through Shizune that she was able to understand she actually liked him. All the signs were there, but she needed outside, mostly indifferent help to figure that out. Kitsune's sudden comprehension didn't change anything between the two of them, though it did make her pay more attention to the blonde than she normally did, at least before he was dragged away for sage training. Now that he was back and participating in the reconstruction, she realized that she had desires to see him more often, and that her jealousy about it was increasing on a daily basis. While Kitsune didn't think of herself as being extraordinarily clever, she knew she was highly intelligent, and believed that Naruto had become what she would consider comfortable around her. When examining human females and their interaction with males, there were quite a few things they were able to do to garner attention from the male they were interested in, which she had gleaned from observing their interactions and reading their somewhat interesting thin books that they called magazines. She had put her information to the test shortly before he left for training, and it appeared as though it worked well. He was very obviously interested, though he looked incredibly nervous about the whole thing. She had tried to see how far she could push him by getting as close as she could, and had definitely not expected that kiss. The redhead still didn't know what to think about it, as she had been testing the attributes of the clone she occupied at the same time, and it had felt odd. Not a bad odd, just. A knocking at the door interrupted her thoughts. Slowly rising from the couch, she casually moved over to the door, trying to sense the presence at the entrance. She could tell that whoever it was had an average-size core, nothing spectacular. It likely wasn't anyone overly important. Once she opened the door, however, one of her delicate eyebrows arched up slightly. "You're one of the last people I ever expected to be here." The Chunin standing near the entrance to Naruto and her apartment merely gave her a lazy shrug, before covering his mouth as he yawned. "It's nice to see you too, Kitsune-san. A bunch of us are gathering together to discuss a topic of some importance, and I was volunteered to come get you." Interested, Kitsune stared at the young man in front of her. Shikamaru was one that never did anything without a reason, she knew. The curiosity about what could be important enough that the Chunin came to get her overrode any dismissal she might have voiced otherwise. "Will Naruto be there?" Kitsune asked as she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "Of course." Shikamaru looked at her, one of his own eyebrows temporarily raising. "We were both talking with Hokage-sama, and she sent me on ahead to gather a few people while Naruto grabs the others. He didn't come get me." Kitsune felt something, she wasn't sure what, but it definitely wasn't pleasant. It made her frown, which her companion definitely noticed. "Your apartment is on the way to where we are meeting. I said I'd get you while he can use his clones to get everyone else." The redhead nodded, but the frown remained. Naruto could have sent a clone to get everyone else, while coming here to get her too. Was the Nara up to something? Not saying anything further, Shikamaru shrugged, then turned around, waving over his shoulder for her to follow. She did, falling into step a few paces behind him. The journey to wherever it was they were headed was a quiet one. Then again, not much needed to be said, since everyone knew of Naruto's participation in stopping the invasion, and somehow convincing Nagato to bring everyone that he killed back to life. She still wasn't entirely sure how he managed to convince the member of Akatsuki to do that, but he did it. All around them were signs of construction, not to mention the sounds. The smell of fresh timber and concrete was heavy in the air, and occasionally she would spot a ninja using a technique that was suited for construction, generally of the earth and water variety. She had even spotted a few of Naruto's clones out among the populace, doing what they could to help out. One thing was for certain, manpower would never be in short supply. A few more minutes of slow walking and they arrived at what appeared to be a resource stocking area, as there were large piles of lumber, various tools, and other construction objects scattered about. The group appeared to be everyone from Naruto's graduating generation, as well as Team Guy. "It's about time you showed up." That was Kiba, looking down from where he was sitting on one of the large lumber piles, Akamaru laying down next to him. "I wasn't in any hurry. Besides, it gave time for everyone else to get here." Shikamaru barely spared Kiba a glance before looking over his shoulder at Kitsune, gesturing for her to step ahead of them and join the others in the area. Nodding, she moved over to the side of one of the stacks of wood and stood by it, apart from everyone else, but yet still together with the group. Taking a quick look around, she saw Sakura sitting on a pile of carved stone nearby, and sent the girl a very small lopsided grin when the redhead saw that the other girl was looking at her too. Once Sakura nodded at her, she continued to look around the rest of the area. Lee and Tenten were both sitting on one of the other stacks of wood, while Niji was standing slightly in front of them with his arms crossed over his chest, looking bored. Ino was standing opposite from where Kitsune had entered, talking quietly to the surprisingly still alive Sai, who was not saying anything and staring at her with the same smile he gave everyone. Shino was standing next to the tall pile of lumber that Kiba was on, hands in his pockets and not moving, as usual. Hinata was a few steps away from him. As her glance passed the pale-eyed girl, Hinata looked away, her hands fidgeting. They hadn't talked since Hinata had professed her love for Naruto, but if that reaction was any indication, she was dreading any conversation they might have. The redhead had no idea if Naruto talked to Hinata yet, as she wasn't really privy to his affairs anymore when her consciousness wasn't in the seal, so if he didn't tell her she wouldn't know. That hadn't been a problem so far, but she might just end up pestering him about this if Hinata couldn't meet her eyes. Voices talking, one of which she recognized well, got closer, only for her to see Chuji and the real Naruto walk around the corner and into the storage area. They stopped talking about whatever it was as they got closer, both of them taking on a more serious countenance. Chuji nodded at Shikamaru, who was still standing by the entrance, and moved over to stand next to Ino, greeting both her and Sai quietly. Naruto, to her pleasant surprise, offered the redhead a brief smile before standing close next to her, on the opposite side from where Sakura was sitting so that the redhead was between them. For some reason, a part of her felt like turning to look and smirk at some of the others in the clearing, but immediately squelched that feeling, though not before wondering what it meant. Now that we're all here, Shikamaru began, grabbing everyone's attention, I can begin. Naruto and I just arrived from the Hokage's office, where she was in discussions with representatives from Cloud. This was news to Kitsune, and after taking a quick glance around the area, it appeared as if it was to everyone else other than Naruto as well. Taking a deep breath and rubbing at his forehead, Shikamaru continued, it's troublesome, but because of the news they bring, Sasuke has finally been declared a missing nin and is now kill or capture on sight for 3 of the 5 nations. Fire, wind, and lightning. There were a few startled exclamations, and Ino even broke down into sobs, much to Kiba's dismay. Oh come on, Ino. You're going to cry over him. Even Sakura isn't crying about this. Casting a glance towards the girl with pink hair, she noticed that the girl had a rather resolute expression on her face as she was staring at Shikamaru, but otherwise made no motion to express that she was upset in any way. Kitsune found herself having to suppress a bit of a grin. Sakura had actually come a long way since the academy. Regardless of what Sakura or anyone else feels, that's the rule now. According to the representatives, he attacked one of their shinobi, a Jinchuriki by the name of Killer Bee. Luckily, Yujito, who some of you already know, was in the area training with him, and they managed to chase off Sasuke and his team with no losses to either side. Ino only started to sob harder. Hinata had moved over to try to comfort the girl a little, but it was obviously half-hearted and didn't seem as if it was doing much good. Sakura also looked like she wanted to do the same, but otherwise hadn't moved. Pretty much all the males, Naruto included, were frowning as they waited for Shikamaru to continue. Sasuke has joined Akatsuki, and since that group has attacked Naruto before, it was not a difficult decision for Hokage-sama to declare him nuke nin. That particular bit of news blindsided Kitsune. She had remembered seeing the brat grow up, albeit from inside Naruto, and now he'd gone and done something foolish like joining the man she hated who was in charge of Akatsuki. Why, if Naruto didn't stop him first, when she got her hands on him she'd. A hand slipping into hers and squeezing it immediately derailed her train of thought. Looking down in shock, she saw that Naruto had grabbed her hand. Blinking a few times, the redhead glanced back up, only to see the blonde teen giving her a rather penetrating stare. You were angry, he murmured. I could feel your rage starting to build. I'm angry too, but your chakra still scares a lot of people, remember? Nodding numbly she looked straight ahead, to see Shikamaru looking pointedly at their joined hands, followed by a knowing look at her face. It was a good thing he didn't smile, otherwise she would have had to jump across the clearing and tear it off. Another squeeze on her hand once again stopped her thoughts, and she found herself looking at the blonde next to her with no small amount of incredulity. "You were doing it again," Naruto chuckled. Huffing and turning away, but still not releasing the hand, she simply gave a dead stare to Shikamaru, waiting for him to continue with his little speech. Now was smiling, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. As Ino's sobs had stopped, he continued speaking to them all. "Naruto wanted me to tell you all that he can handle Sasuke alone, if the need arises. Otherwise you should probably just avoid him, as he is rather strong." When no one made any comments, he nodded. "That's everything about Sasuke." In other news, a Gakage meet has been requested, and as such Hokage-sama will be heading for Iron Country, a neutral land that uses samurai instead of ninja. Each Kage is allowed 2 escorts, so she will be taking Hitaki Kakashi with her. She also wishes to take Sakura. Here, Shikamaru turned to look at the girl in question. "If you're willing to go, that is." Even though she appeared startled at first, the girl immediately stood up. "Oh, of course I'll go, if Tsunade Shosho needs me." "Good. She wants you to report to her about the assignment. She doesn't want to take Naruto," a male voice cut in. Everyone turned briefly to look at Niji, who had asked the question, then looked back at Shikamaru only to see him shrug. It would have been too troublesome to ask why. She would likely rather have him here, as he is this village's best defense, as the fight with pain showed everyone. There were scattered sounds of agreement through the area, even Niji nodded, accepting that. Kitsune tossed a glance at Naruto, who simply grinned at her before looking back at Shikamaru. He was acting nonchalant about the whole thing, so he either knew this already or didn't care, which she found unlikely. The redhead knew she'd just have to pry it out of him later. "If no one else has any questions, that's all. Naruto and I just figured it would be easier to tell everyone about Sasuke at once so that we all know. Now, if no one minds, I'm going to go take a nap." 12 days later, Wanisama. Kitsune nearly stumbled as someone with a familiar voice ran into her from behind, wrapping arms around her just under her chest. It only took a moment for her mind to restart, as it had almost stopped from shock. "Oh ho, Wanisama, is it just me or are these bigger than the last time I remember seeing you?" The arms from before were no longer wrapped around her waist, but now 2 hands were cupping the undersides of her breasts, lifting them slightly. Now she was completely shocked. Not even Naruto dash. Slapping the hands away, she quickly turned around and jumped backwards, only to see Nico leaning forward slightly and grinning at her. "And Nico. What are you doing here? Why did you do that to me?" Nico, who now looked like a girl in her mid-teens instead of an academy student, covered her mouth, her eyes wide. "Wanisama. You're acting more realistic. It's so amazing. I'm so proud of you." The teen made a move to jump on the reedhead, but Kitsune swiftly sidestepped the other humanized Biju, letting her crash into the dirt road. "Moo. Wanisama, you were supposed to catch me." "Ouch ouch ouch." Kitsune didn't offer any kind of response, but instead looked over at the others who had stopped to watch the goings-on. She had only glimpsed them before, but now with Nico on the ground she had a good opportunity to see who was watching. Tsunade was the first person she saw, which likely meant that whatever happened during the Gakage meet was now over. The woman had a small grin on her face as she watched the goings-on. Next to her on either side were her 2 escorts, Kakashi and Sakura. Naruto's one-time sensei had his nose in his book, as usual, while Sakura was looking around the village instead of at her, probably taking in the changes around the village as it was being fixed up. Behind them a few paces were some other people, 2 of which she recognized, and 2 that she didn't. The 2 that she did recognize were Yujito and Kankuro. The former had her hand palming her face while the latter was grinning at her. The 2 she didn't recognize were a girl with close-cut black hair and a forehead protector for rock. The other was a taller man with blue hair and an eye patch, wearing the insignia for mist. "You're back from the meet?" Tsunade nodded. "Yes. It went well. Have you seen Naruto recently?" Kitsune shook her head negatively. "Not since this morning. He said he was going to train today. There are still plenty of his clones around the village, though." I'm sure one of them will stop to talk to you. True. Tsunade looked around, as if searching for one. We're heading for my office. Is it alright if we leave Nico with you? Kitsune wasn't sure how much of that was actually a question and how much of it was an order. Looking down at the other Biju, who was now sitting on the ground and pouting, she nodded. It's fine. I'm sure I can find something for her to do. Good. If you see Naruto before I do, tell him to report to my office, okay? Understood. In the past she might have scoffed at taking orders from anyone, Naruto included. Now, however, it was no inconvenience to her and she didn't mind taking orders from those she had come to respect. That list of those she respected was still very, very small, but Tsunade was one of the first people on it. Thank you. Okay, everyone. Follow me please. Kitsune stood there as she watched the group pass her and Nico by, returning a greeting with Yujito as the blonde-haired woman approached before leaving with the rest of the group. She tried not to glare as the man with blue hair stared at her with a frown on his face, and the girl from Rock wasn't much better. Both of them looked away when she eventually did stare right back at them, though. Matatabi, what's going on? Any pretense of acting like a child was immediately dropped as the other teen rose to her feet. So we're using real names now? I have no idea what's going on other than what Yujito has been told. There are representatives here from each village to make plans for war. Madara. Toby, whatever he's called, he attacked the summit and essentially declared war on every hidden village. You're joking. Far from it, I'm afraid. He declared the beginning of the Fourth War. This time though, all the villages will be working together instead of against each other. This Toby character, he wants to create the perfect genjutsu. To do that he needs the chakra of all the Biju, so he's declaring war in an effort to get us. How will that work? We'll just be even better protected and hidden away. Nico shrugged. I have no idea. He's a madman, Wani-sama. Kitsune snorted, then started walking while gesturing for the other Biju to follow. Let's go to my apartment. We can talk more there. Sure. As they walked, Kitsune took a moment to look over Nico's new form. So what made you decide to change? Nico tossed her sister a grin before shrugging. It's easier being taller. I tried a few different ages when sparring with Yujito, and we figured this one was probably the best when it came to make myself appear unassuming to any opponents we might come across. Much like you, Wani-sama. Kitsune hummed slightly. It made sense, she had originally taken a form like this to assist Naruto with his training, after all. Unless, that's not the only reason you appear the same age as Naruto-sama. There was a definite teasing lilt in Nico's tone that Kitsune detected. She tossed a glare at her companion, but said nothing, and continued walking. Nico's giggles that followed let Kitsune know that she was well aware of the other reason why she kept the form of a teenager. The only reason I'm not attacking you is because I need your help with something. That and... I'll admit, there may be some truth to what you're likely thinking. Nico bounded up alongside her almost immediately. So it's true. You're finally feeling your emotions. To a certain degree, yes. Naruto has been helping me understand, as have others I've come to trust. Nico tapped at her chin, making a show of thinking hard. Before long, she glanced at her fellow Biju, a gleam in her eye. Are emotions the only things Naruto has been showing you? She nudged the redhead in the side a little as she grinned. I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't believe that. I saw the way you were acting whenever I got close to him. Especially after I kissed him. You were jealous then, Nico stated, matter-of-factly. It would be reasonable of me to believe that those sorts of feelings have only gotten stronger since. Kitsune immediately wanted to argue, but she knew her companion was speaking the truth now. She had been jealous, and that was one of the emotions that she had been struggling the most with lately. You're right, I was jealous then. She was waiting for Nico to make a comment, but when she didn't, Kitsune looked over to see why not. The other Biju was staring at her, though it looked sad. You like him, don't you? Kitsune immediately looked away, thinking about it. Did she? Probably, since she enjoyed being around him in general, and was aware that jealousy was running rampant in her mind when he wasn't around or when he was around another female that was about his age. Hinata's confession had definitely thrown her for a loop. She was still trying to figure out how to deal with it. Naruto hadn't talked to her about it either, so she was left wondering what he had told the other girl, if anything. I think I do. But other than give him power, I can't really do anything else for him. Yes you can. Show him some affection, Kitsune scoffed. Even that can only go so far. I can train with him, and try to show him I care. But this body isn't real. Not even Nico had a comeback for that, so the two of them traveled in silence for a bit longer. It wasn't until they were almost at the apartment that the other Biju began talking again. You know, a little over a month ago I was talking to Gyuki, and he gave me an idea. He remarked that our chakra is so potent it can do some incredible things, inhabiting these fake bodies is just one of them. He also commented that with all the hosts he's been sealed in, he has a pretty good idea of how the human body works now. Kitsune had stopped walking and turned to look at Nico, wondering where the other Biju was going. The other girl was pointing out various places on her person as she explained the various organs that made up a human body, and how they work together. I know all this, Nico. I've been sealed twice before. I've got 2 chakra imprints of female human bodies and one of Naruto's. I've created real skin for a face and some blood temporarily. Wait. Are you? Kitsune trailed off, finally catching on to what Nico was getting at. The other Biju was giving her a sly look, obviously knowing where her thoughts would end up. Kitsune watched as one of Nico's fingernails elongated before she cut the back of her other hand with it. The redhead could only watch in amazement as real blood leaked from the shallow wound. How? Kitsune took a moment to gather her thoughts. She already knew what Nico must have done. She herself had experimented with it to small degrees, but it took so much focus just to do small body parts. Interesting, but doing more than just a body part or two, I wouldn't be able to focus on my chakra after a while and might lose control of it. Not only that, but the seal may be a problem as well. Is yours still locked? Nico inquired. Not completely. I'm not blocked, but I can't freely leave the seal either, obviously. It's the same for myself and Gyuki-kun, so there won't be a problem. Gyuki-kun helped me and I helped him. Since you and Naruto-sama even allowed us this opportunity, I'm going to share it with you. All you have to do is start creating. I'll make sure your chakra doesn't go out of control. The redhead just stared at her current companion, not believing what she was hearing. There would be no need anymore to have Naruto summon her into a construct. She could be there and help and protect him for real. I can tell you're surprised, Wani-sama. Nico moved over and grabbed her arm. She didn't try to pull away this time. Let's go back to your place like you said. It shouldn't take long. If you want to surprise Naruto-sama, the sooner we can get it done, the better. A little over an hour later, Kitsune gasped as she breathed deeply in and out for what felt like the first time. Well, technically it was the first time in a human body anyway. If there was one thing she could say right away, it was that being in a human body hurt. The new nerves that she had were constantly active and felt like they were on fire. She was currently trying to stand as still as possible as to not brush up against anything, including herself, as she could only imagine what it would feel like. Pain was a relatively foreign sensation to her as a Biju. All of her senses barring sight and smell were diluted when she was in her Biju form, and that carried over into the shadow clone constructs she had been inhabiting for years now. The uncomfortable sensation of nerves firing was the first feeling she got of what it meant to be in pain. Excellent work, Wani-sama. I knew you wouldn't have any problems. Your body looks just like the construct. Oh. Of course. I used it as a blueprint. Her voice sounded different. It was more dull than she was used to hearing, though perhaps it's just because a human's ears didn't hear things the same way hers used to. Her eyesight as well didn't pick up the same details that it had previously. I can tell by the look on your face that you've realized your hearing and eyesight have changed. While that is true, you'll notice that your taste and touch have improved greatly. As for smell, well, it's a little worse than normal, but smell is one of the easiest senses to adjust with a little boost of chakra. Kitsune stared dumbly at Nico, trying to place all of what she was being told into perspective. She could deal with the losses to her hearing and eyesight, and apparently her ability to smell things could be adjusted on the fly. Taste was never a big factor as she never really needed to eat, it was more or less something she did that made her more human-like. All the food she ate was instantly turned into chakra, so she never had any waste. That would be something she'd have to learn to deal with in a human body. The ability to actually touch and feel things was an entirely new experience, along with the apparent pain it brought. Honestly, it was one of the things she was most looking forward to, but if it always felt like this, then being human sucked. Does it always hurt like this? She gasped out. No. I was worried about that too, but it goes away. It's just because your nerves are new and are getting used to, well, being alive. Good. This sucks. Nico chuckled, but was still maintaining the barrier around Kitsune's body in case any of her chakra decided to go crazy. For the most part, it hadn't been a problem. The sound of a door opening and closing, followed by footsteps, made both of the Biju look up and towards the door. Before either of them could think to do anything, the door to the room opened and a tired-looking Naruto stepped in, looking down at the ground while unzipping his jacket. As he prepared to pull one of his arms out of a sleeve, he looked up and stopped dead. "En Nico? Kitsune? What dash?" His gaze settled on the redhead for a second and his eyes nearly bugged out of his head. I am sorry, Kaya. Kitsune ducked down, trying to hide behind the other side of the new bed in the apartment. Her scream surprised even herself for a moment, but she didn't have any time to dwell on it as pain flared up against her skin where it had brushed against the bed, and along her legs where she was now squatting on the floor. With a further shouted apology, Naruto quickly stepped out of the room and slammed both the door to their room and the apartment's front door behind him. Whyyyy. Kitsune heard her voice as it was coming out in a wail. Between the pain and the surprise, she didn't know what was going on. Nico had moved over in an attempt to comfort the redhead, but was afraid to touch her and cause more pain. It will be okay. No, it won't. Kitsune felt something falling down the front of her face due to her hypersensitive nerves, but the pain elsewhere was worse, so she ignored it. I've never done that before. I scared him off. Even I don't know why I screamed like that. I've never screamed. She felt herself breathing faster, but for some reason she couldn't slow it down. The knowledge that she couldn't control her breathing only made it happen faster still. Pain flared up on her face when Nico forcefully grabbed it and turned her head so that they were looking each other in the eyes. Wani-sama. Calm down. You're starting to hyperventilate, it will make you go unconscious and we don't want to risk that right now. Human bodies are more fragile than you'd believe. Focusing on the words of her sister, she managed to finally realize what was going on, and her breathing did in fact start to slow. The pain lessened as well once Nico removed her hands from the redhead's cheeks. When Gyuki-kun and I did this, we were sore for a few hours and that was all. After that everything normalizes and you can touch and feel things. Some things feel so nice. Nico let out a sigh as she held her hands to her cheeks, obviously thinking about something. Kitsune didn't really have much to say, she was simply focusing on trying to make the nagging pain go away, while thinking about how embarrassed she was for Naruto to see her. Why did he have to show up right at that moment? She wanted it to be a complete surprise. She wanted him to see her body at the time and place of her choosing, not right after it was created. At least he only saw her back. Nico. Yes, Wani-sama, I have clothing in my seal. Do you think I can pull it out? Nico tapped her chin for a moment, pondering. That's very clever of you, Wani-sama. It should work. If it's in your seal, then you should be able to grab it if you pull on any of your chakra from within Naruto-sama. You'll always be linked to him. Kitsune had gathered that much based upon the seal that had shown up on her navel once she had finished building the chakra system of her new body. Based upon the scripting of it, the entire seal was completely inverted compared to the one on Naruto. She supposed that it made sense, but was too exhausted both mentally and physically to think much about it. It probably had something to do with the seal being locked again. Regardless of that, she searched for her chakra in her new body and found it, along with what felt like a faint link right around her navel that led off to wherever Naruto likely was now. Imagining the outfit she wanted, a slight tug on her chakra link made a puff of smoke surround her briefly. Kitsune knew it worked as soon as a comfortable weight settled on her once naked form. Now she was clothed, at least, and only had to tolerate the brief moments of pain as the clothes rubbed against her sensitive skin. "Oh, Wani-sama, that looks good on you." Kitsune stood up once she was clothed, and looked down at her figure. It was just one of many outfits she had seen and purchased, and was considered casual wear. The outfit consisted of a simple dark blue tank top and black track pants. The colors contrasted with her dark red hair, which somehow maintained the black ends, and her pale white skin, presenting an image she felt was acceptable. "Thank you, Nico." While she wasn't sure how to accept the compliment, she felt grateful to hear it. Since compliments weren't something that she ever really got, it was good to get in the practice. Some small part of her also felt more naturally comfortable talking with Nico than she likely would with any other human, if only because she wasn't entirely human herself. The biggest difference now was that she was inhabiting a human body of her own creation rather than a complex chakra construct. "Are you still in pain?" Nico's question refocused the redhead's thoughts, and she absently picked at her clothes where they felt more uncomfortable. "A little. It's starting to settle into a dull throb, and only hurts a little more where the clothes are brushing against me. Like you said, I'll probably be fine in an hour or two." She noticed as the other light brown-haired teen nodded slowly, then asked another question: "Should we go find Naruto-sama?" Kitsune found herself exhaling sharply through her nostrils, startling herself at the odd feeling. Rubbing the bridge of her nose, she ultimately decided against it. "I can find him whenever I need to thanks to our bond. I think I scared him. I know him well enough to know that he'll be a nervous wreck if I'm looking for him too soon. If he's not home by dinner, I'll go looking." "Okay. I'm going to go find Yujito-chan then. We can talk more after you've talked to Naruto-sama." The redhead nodded as she slowly moved over onto the new bed. Laying across it made her wince a few times, but she eventually managed to find a position that didn't hurt too badly. "Wani-sama, I'm sure you realize that since you have a human body now, you have to eat, sleep, bathe, and all that other stuff too. But at least now you can make kissy face with Naruto-sama. Among other things." Nico began making kissing noises with her mouth, only to get a pillow in the face. "Shut up." Giggling as she placed the pillow back on the bed, Nico was silent as she walked over towards the door. Opening it and stepping through, just as she was about to exit she looked over her shoulder. "How long until you claim him, Wani-sama?" Nico closed the door as the pillow was thrown once again. Kitsune let out a very human-like sigh as she heard Nico chuckling before the front door opened and closed once again. "I don't know." 75 minutes later, Naruto sat on one of the benches in the still intact areas of Konoha that hadn't been scarred by the attack. The sun had set behind the horizon and the number of people still out and wandering around had dwindled down to a small trickle. All construction that he could hear had long since stopped as well. When he wasn't training or otherwise doing something else, this was one of his favorite spots in Konoha. It was the spot where his old Team 7 used to hang out after they finished their missions for the day back when they were doing D ranks. One of the shops nearby used to sell the flavored ice pops that he learned to enjoy, and he continued that tradition with Jiraiya before his severe injury. He hadn't seen the man for a while now. Naruto had no idea where the old pervert was recovering. The last one he bought he had enjoyed with Irika, after talking to the scarred Chunin for a few hours about his old master. He was lucky to have someone like his academy instructor to talk to. He liked to think of the other man as what it would be like to have an older brother, or perhaps an uncle. Honestly, he used to look at him as a stand-in for a father, at least until he found out who his real father was. He stared at the ice pop in his hand now, wishing he had someone to break off the other half and share it with. Kitsune was never really interested in them because she didn't need to eat anyway. The one time they had shared one, she had bitten into it, chewed it, and finished off the entire thing in about a minute. Then she stared at him as if curious about what was supposed to be so special about it. Sighing, he watched as it dripped slightly. It wasn't too warm outside, though there was no chill in the air even with his jacket off. It was resting on the bench next to him, leaving his top only clothed in his mesh undershirt. He had been out training earlier until one of his clones dispelled, letting him know that the group had returned from the Kage summit, along with a few extra visitors. Even though he had wanted to get cleaned up before he arrived in Tsunade's office, she wanted him there right away. He had gotten there as quick as he could, only leaving his jacket draped over his shoulder and entered through the window. In hindsight, it probably wasn't the smartest idea, if only because of the response it had garnered from the people in the office. While Tsunade, Shikamaru, and the blue-haired Miss Shinobi named Ao didn't even so much as bat an eye. Sakura, on the other hand, began to blush and wouldn't look at him after he greeted her. Yujito didn't make a scene, but she was the closest to the window where he entered and was very friendly, going so far as to give him a kiss on the cheek. After introductions, he found out that the girl with the rock insignia was named Kuratsuchi, and she was the granddaughter of the Tsuchikage. He didn't say anything other than hello, and she barely returned the greeting. It seemed as if she couldn't make up her mind whether she wanted to scowl at him or eye him up like a piece of meat. Other than that, the meeting went off without any problems. Tsunade had wanted him there to explain the results of the meeting and explain that Tobi, or Madara, or whatever name he wanted to go by, had declared war on the shinobi world. They would all be working together to protect the remaining Biju, because the alternative was everyone stuck in an eternal genjutsu. That ended his participation in the meeting, and excusing himself, he was going to go home, take a shower, and get changed. Unfortunately, it didn't really happen like that. He was totally shocked to find Kitsune in his, or their, room, naked. Not only that, but Nico was there too, holding a seal. He had no idea what was going on, but all he did know was that he had never walked in on Kitsune completely nude before. Then the scream. In all their time together he had never heard her make a sound like that, and it was something that always seemed a little too, well, human, for her to do. Luckily, her back had been to him, otherwise he might not be alive right now. She hadn't really injured him badly outside of training, though it was impossible to say if seeing her nude wouldn't send her over the edge. It was strange seeing Nico in the room, or at least a girl who resembled what Nico looked like in her younger form. He didn't really get a good look at her since, well, he was too busy looking at Kitsune. It would make sense if it was her, though, since Yujito was here, even if his fellow Jinchuriki didn't say anything. To be fair, she didn't really have a chance to. So are you actually going to eat that before it melts completely? Startled from his thoughts, Naruto froze, recognizing the voice immediately. He desperately hoped that he wasn't about to die. Yeah. I was just thinking. When he didn't finish, the person next to him let out a giggle. Some of it was about me, I hope. The blonde found himself nodding before he could stop himself. When he did, he stopped the motion, a look of horror spreading across his features. Good. Now, let's break that popsicle. I want to try it again before it's all melted on the ground. Naruto lifted the arm that was holding his stick and handed it over in a stiff, robotic motion. Not one part of the rest of his body moved at all. There was a slight tug as the other half of the ice pop was pulled off before the arm went slack again, dropping back down to rest over his thigh and knee. It wasn't until he heard a slurping noise that the blonde finally chose to look at the person sitting next to him. Kitsune was there, looking at the ice pop in front of her face with a sense of wonder. She stuck her tongue out and tentatively licked it a couple more times. Cold, but good. Very good. Naruto stared as the redhead started up with long, languid licks up and down the popsicle, until finally putting the top of it in her mouth and sucking on it. He couldn't help but be transfixed at the way her cheek caved in slightly, as well as the popping noise her lips made as they released the cold treat. It wasn't until she turned to look at him with a raised eyebrow that he realized he was staring. Blushing, he immediately turned away, and started to suck on his own while trying to put what he saw out of his mind. This is much better than I thought it would be. Moving his ice pop away, he partially turned to look at the redhead sitting next to him. She was staring at her half with a serious expression, as if she had never seen anything like it before. Did you manage to improve your ability to taste? He finally asked. Kitsune shot him a look that made him flinch, but her smile that followed almost made him relax. Almost. I've improved more than just taste. Naruto turned to look at her, blinking stupidly. With another grin, Kitsune moved her free hand forward and brushed across his cheek, her fingertips tracing the whisker marks that stretched across them. I can feel things much better now, too. The blonde could see some things clearly even though sunlight was rapidly disappearing. He knew that he was blushing now, and it appeared as though Kitsune was too. Looking at her face, he couldn't help but notice her eyes. Her pupils, which used to always be crescent-shaped, were now round just like his. The bright red of her eyes hadn't changed, though, and that was something he was thankful for. They were rather unique and he liked them that way. Your eyes changed, he muttered. Kitsune nodded. I can still see, though not quite as clearly as I used to. Really? I mean your eyes, the pupils are round now. Like everyone else. The redhead simply stared at him, but otherwise didn't seem too surprised. Do you prefer them the other way? Naruto quickly shook his head, dislodging her hand from where it was resting on his cheek. And no, I'm fine with either one. They're still bright red, and I like that because it's unique. Everyone likes them, I mean. Not just me. Kitsune continued staring at him for a moment before turning on the bench to look straight ahead. Humming to herself for a second, she lifted the popsicle to take a few more licks of it since it had started melting again. Seeing her do that, Naruto figured he'd better do the same before it all went to waste. Kitsune's next question came a few seconds later. Are you afraid of me, Naruto? Naruto's tongue paused on his popsicle for a moment before he removed it and let out a sigh. Not really, no. Why? Kitsune hummed again before taking another lick. Because you seem to be. You've been avoiding me when you think you do something that offends me. You seem to forget that I am not I mean, I am not like other women. The blonde stopped licking at his ice pop, and turned a critical eye towards his companion. He was a bit thick-headed, sure, but not totally oblivious. It was impossible to miss that slip. She must also have a reason to point out that she was different from others, right? Trying to look at her nonchalantly, he shifted a bit on the bench so that he could examine her while trying not to make it too obvious. Unlike her eyes, her hair hadn't really changed. It was still the deep red with the black ends, or at least it didn't appear to have changed in the quickly fading light. She was wearing another set of clothes that he had never seen before, however. Her pants were loose-fitting, but her tank top was on the tight side and it showed off her midriff. Do you think these clothes look good on me, Naruto? Quickly looking away, the blonde blushed, knowing he'd been caught. No matter how inconspicuous he tried to be, she just always seemed to know. Why yeah, they look good. Save for a slight hitch in his voice when he started talking, Naruto did his best to seem nonchalant with his answer. Switching focus back to what remained of his popsicle, he had to lick the back of his hand because the treat was melting in earnest now. The redhead didn't say anything in response, instead Naruto felt as her arm began to brush against his as a result of her moving over to his side of the bench. Rigid now, the blonde began to blush harder as he saw her scooting over the rest of the way through his peripheral vision, until both her arm and leg were pressing against his own. Kitsune. She turned to look at him, flicking the tip of her tongue along the length of her ice pop. Why, what are you doing? Pulling the ice treat away from her face, she looked at him, then back to it. I'm eating. No, I mean, you moved over to this side of the bench and you're doing that thing with your tongue. You mean this? Turning to face him while bringing the ice pop back up to her mouth, she twirled her tongue around the top of it before sucking the entire thing, what remained of it, anyway, into her mouth until only the stick was visible. Kitsune let it sit in her mouth for a few seconds before staring at the blonde with half-lidded eyes, then slowly pulling the icy treat back out, making a loud slurping noise. Naruto could only sit there, completely transfixed as Kitsune made a show of slowly licking her lips. He had no idea where to look, at her lips, her eyes, the remains of the popsicle, or at the clearly visible cleavage she had on display as her chest was currently pressed against his arm. His eyes began to quickly dart between all four, until finally settling on her lips again. The ambient lighting was just enough for him to notice that her lips were very, very red. When and where did she learn to do this? Without warning, the redhead suddenly pulled back, sitting straight on the bench and working over the remains of her ice pop again. Naruto had to fight off a sudden surge of disappointment. He thought that, well, he wasn't sure what to think, but he wasn't exactly fighting the urge to kiss her again. Not only that, but the blonde was rather certain that Kitsune was trying to get him to do just that. Perhaps he took too long to make up his mind. Unfortunately, he didn't know if it was part of her nature as a Biju or not, but she was very good at hiding her intentions and only telling him things when she felt like it. That was something that had never changed since he knew her. Finish your popsicle, Naruto. Kitsune murmured between licks of what little now remained of her own. Looking down, he noted that a fair amount of the ice pop had now melted and was forming a small puddle between his feet. It also looked about ready to fall off the stick. Carefully lifting it, he leaned forward from where he sat on the bench and put it in his mouth. It was barely hanging on, so closing his lips around the stick he pulled it out as he tried to keep his tongue from freezing. Shaking his head, the blonde tried to deal with the freeze as Kitsune took the wooden stick from his hands. She had been watching him finish his, and as the rest of his popsicle melted in his mouth, he observed as Kitsune did the same thing he just did. The redhead seemed to struggle with the cold for a moment before swallowing. Naruto was sure something about her had changed now if temperature was affecting her. "Can you feel temperatures now?" Kitsune glanced at him, and simply smirked instead of responding. Turning her gaze back to the two popsicle sticks she now had in her hand, the blonde felt a brief pulse of chakra before the sticks were engulfed in a bright white flame. They were dropped on the ground, and Naruto couldn't help but stare as they burned to ash in mere seconds. Wow! What technique was the dash? The blonde didn't get a chance to finish as Kitsune moved from her seat to briefly stand in front of him, only to climb back onto the bench with her knees resting on the wood as she straddled his waist. He was pressed firmly against the back of the bench, and even if he tried to lean sideways the redhead's arms and hands quickly moved to either side, wrapping around his neck. Anything else he might have thought about the situation quickly ground to a halt as her lips pressed against his. Naruto's first thoughts were of surprise, quickly followed by pleasure. Her lips were cold, but the tongue that tentatively worked its way into his mouth was very warm. In a few seconds they had gotten further into this kiss than they did during their first one, but the blonde's mind was too focused to realize that fact. He didn't begin to think about other things until Kitsune's weight finally settled against him. He was surprised, because as far as he knew, a shadow clone only weighed about half, if that, of the person who summoned them. Since Kitsune was formed from her own chakra, she was nearly weightless, and instead used her chakra to reinforce and propel her limbs whenever they sparred. Her weight was something that was surprisingly comfortable though, and he found his hands moving up to settle on her slim waist. He was understandably startled when part of his hand that settled above her waistband met with warm flesh. They both stopped kissing each other at the exact same moment. He did because of surprise, but Kitsune had her own reason. He literally felt her quiver slightly as she was leaning against him, panting slightly. That felt good. "What did you do?" Naruto blinked as he stared into the redhead's eyes. He didn't often talk to girls when their faces were centimeters from his. What? "I just put my hand on your waist. Did you do something when you touched my skin?" "Your skin?" "Wait, since when dash?" Kitsune fisted her hands in Naruto's hair, tugging his head back sharply, causing him to let out a startled yelp. To silence him, the redhead placed her mouth over his for a few seconds, teasing him, but pulled back when he seemed about ready to deepen it. She had lifted herself off of his waist, but dragged her body up along his until her chest was at his chin and she was looking over him, her loose hair framing her face as it fluttered about from her movements. During the course of her adjustment, Naruto's hands had slid from her waist down to the middle of her thighs. Having his hands on her made the redhead feel strange, in a good way. But it was nothing like before. "Move your hands back up." "But dash." She tugged his hair again, only a little more gentle this time. He still winced. "Do it." Acquiescing to her request, the blonde's hands moved up again. As his palms reached her waist, he skipped over her waistband and placed his hands instead directly on her skin right above her hips. He watched curiously as her eyes went wide and her nostrils flared, not to mention her entire body shuddered against his. "What did you do?" she whispered, staring at him intently. Naruto wasn't quite sure what she meant. "I just touched you." "That's it." The redhead's eyes narrowed. "You mean to tell me that such a simple action feels like that?" It sent a strange shivering sensation down my spine, yet another sensations I have never felt before. Kitsune's grasp on his hair loosened as he looked to the side, obviously flustered. "You know, I am not really an expert, but I've heard and read that people tingle like that when they are touched by someone they like." He would have said love, but the Kitsune he was dealing with now was definitely an unknown quantity. Naruto hoped that her actions and words meant good things for the both of them, but better safe than sorry. "Like, you say?" Kitsune hummed as she slid her body back down his, once again settling in his lap. He didn't lower his hands, and before he was really aware of what was happening, both had slipped underneath her tank top to rest about halfway up her torso. She shuddered again, and Naruto could have sworn he heard her softly moan. His arousal shot up through the roof, enough to the point that he was absolutely certain Kitsune could feel it from where she was resting in his lap. Unfortunately, he had no way of knowing, but to be honest, at this point he didn't really care. It was unlikely Kitsune would kill him since she was the one who started it, after all. Or so he hoped, anyway. Naruto. Kitsune mumbled against his shoulder. It took a moment for his own brain to register that she had called his name. Yes, I don't think it should feel like this, but I don't know. Kitsune moved her hands to his chest, then slowly pushed back, lifting herself away. I have no experience of things like this, so I'm confused. Something might have gone wrong. It's too late to bother Matatabi or Hokage-sama about it, too. Naruto simply stared as the redhead lifted herself from his lap, only to stand unsteadily in front of him. Her tank top was still hitched up slightly on one side and her hair was a bit messy, but she made no effort to correct either. What went wrong? Who's Matatabi? He also wanted to ask about since when she started calling Tsunade Hokage-sama, but that would be for another time. Kitsune's gaze upon him immediately sharpened. As to what went wrong, I don't know exactly, but I think Hokage-sama might be able to tell me. Regarding Matatabi, the redhead looked away for a moment, long enough for Naruto to slowly rise to his feet. When Kitsune turned away, he wasn't expecting to get an answer, as that was the way she normally operated. If she didn't want him to know something, she simply wouldn't say anything. Matatabi is Nico's name, the one given to us by the old man, the sage of six paths. However, Kitsune turned to pin him with a sharp glare, one that caught him by surprise. As it is her true name, it should have been hers to tell. I was in the wrong to say it. If she says it to you, act as if you don't know it. Am I clear, Crystal? I won't say a word, I promise. A slow smile crept across her face. Good. You've never broken a promise. Don't let this be the first. As our names are the last thing we have left of the old man, if there is something a Biju could consider precious, our names are that something. Naruto began to nod, but then stopped, only to stare curiously at her. So, that means you have one too. Kitsune hesitated, but then nodded very slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Naruto frowned a little, somewhat dismayed that she hadn't told him, but on the other hand could respect that as the only thing she still had of the man who had literally created her, it was her prerogative to share it or keep it to herself. His grin and shrug obviously caught her off guard, if the surprise on her face was any indication. It's getting late, and I'm tired from all the training. I'm gonna go to bed early so we can go visit Tsunade-bachan early tomorrow. As he started walking towards their new apartment, Kitsune moved up quickly next to him, and this time surprised the blonde by grabbing his hand and intertwining her fingers with his as they walked. Neither of them said another word the rest of the way back. The following morning, while I honestly can't claim to know exactly what you did, Tsunade stated in a slow drawl, you are now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, human. Kitsune stared at the Hokage with a small smile on her face as she sat on the edge of one of the hospital beds. So the things I've felt have been normal, then? Not just with touching things, but when I closed my eyes last night I have no memory of what transpired between then and when Naruto made me become aware again. Is that really sleep? Tsunade glanced up from her chart, smirking at the Biju turned human. You're sleeping with Naruto now? Yesterday was the first time. I normally get bored and either meditate or watch Naruto. This time I simply laid down next to him, and the next thing I remember was that it was daytime instead of night. Even Naruto seemed surprised, as I have never done that before. The Hokage's smirk lessened slightly, it was likely too soon for Kitsune to understand the double meaning behind sleeping with someone. It was probably your new body adjusting to being human for the first time. After a while it is probable that you'll need to sleep for perhaps 1 or 2 hours a day, as even most shinobi only need 4 to 5 hours. We'll have to run a few more tests, but your metabolism seems to be extremely active. Do you know why that is? Tsunade shrugged. Your body was formed because of your chakra, which I only have theories about how it was even possible. That right there is most likely the main reason behind it. But then even in your Biju form you were able to have solid bodies to a certain extent, so I guess it wasn't much of a stretch for you to make a human body, correct? Though as I mentioned to Naruto, my senses have changed, 3 of them have gotten worse while 2 have improved. I can only offer you more theories, though there have been many documented cases with humans that a loss of one sense, like sight or hearing, improves all the others in response. This is likely another case of that, but on a much grander scale. Your sight, hearing, and smell aren't what they used to be, but your taste has improved, as you said. I don't believe you had a true nervous system as a Biju, and humans have quite a complicated one even when compared to other animals, so it will be an entirely new experience for you. The redhead nodded, then placed one of her hands just above her hips. It already has. Naruto touched me right here before, and it felt like a shock traveled through my body. Not to say it was a bad shock, it was simply, beyond description. The Hokage stared curiously at her patient. If she had to affix a description to the look on Kitsune's face, it was one of passive serenity, like the woman was reliving a fond memory that she enjoyed. You say Naruto touched you there? Did he touch your skin directly? Kitsune barely thought about it for a second before slowly nodding. Yes, one of Tsunade's eyebrows arched upward. Was it accidental, or purposeful? This time her patient seemed a little more confused about how to answer. To be fair to Naruto, I think it was accidental, as he was. Much to Tsunade's surprise, Kitsune actually seemed to squirm a bit where she was sitting, her hands now in her lap fidgeting with her robe. The redhead had trailed off and wouldn't look Tsunade in the eye. This was very odd behavior coming from the usually blunt Biju. As she was about to ask what happened, the redhead managed to stutter out the rest. I had started Kage kissing him, and at one point he reached up and touched my side. It felt so good and made me shiver. At first I thought he had done something, but when he claimed that it was only a normal touch, I thought I had messed up somehow when creating this body. Now though, you tell me that this is normal. Yes, it is normal. Tsunade resisted the urge to rub her forehead. If you were in fact kissing Naruto, then your new body was likely releasing endorphins, which is a chemical that gradually makes you feel even better. However, since that body is so new and you aren't used to it, you're likely also hypersensitive. The Hokage paused for a moment, before pinning the redhead with a sharp look. Just how far did you get with Naruto, if you don't mind me asking? How far did we get? This time the blonde had to bite back a groan. She kept forgetting who she was dealing with. Did you do anything else after you kissed him? Kitsune quickly shook her head, looking curious. There is more to do. I have only copied what I have seen from others when I observed them in the village, and brief moments before I was sealed. Does it feel even better than kissing? The almost childlike curiosity amused Tsunade for a brief moment as she slowly nodded. I'm going to assume that your creator didn't give you any insights into human reproduction or mating rituals, stuff like that? Kitsune's slow negative headshake was all the answer she needed. Never thought I'd be giving a Biju the talk. Tsunade looked away, mumbling to herself before setting down the medical chart on the empty bed next to her stool. Letting out a brief sigh and getting mentally prepared, she turned in the chair to face Kitsune once again. The woman was still staring at her with open, undisguised curiosity. I know from your exam that you made your body perfectly, including all the relevant parts that make up a female human. Tsunade made a gesture towards Kitsune's lower half. Did you ever wonder what that spot between your legs is for? The blonde didn't know whether to watch in amusement or pity as Kitsune lifted up the hem of the hospital gown and proceeded to examine herself. It was only with belated recognition that Tsunade remembered an earlier conversation she had with the Biju. They were technically gender neutral. That meant unless they actually chose one, like Kitsune had, they would have no idea about reproduction at all. There was one bit of curiosity as she recalled a brief conversation she had with Naruto after Yujito and Nico had left the first time, after he had gotten the Nibi out of the seal. Nico had claimed that they were in fact once human, but that the split power from the Ten-Tails had completely overwhelmed their human bodies. Their souls were effectively stripped from their mortal shells and made to anchor a portion of the Jubi's chakra, keeping it in separate parts. The first attempts had met with partial success. Shikaku was obviously half-crazed, and Nibi was extremely hyper and energetic. But by the time the sage had gotten around to the 8 and 9 tails, they were rather normal, all things considered. A startled yelp drew her attention back to the redhead sitting on the bed, who was now tugging down furiously on the hospital gown and looking away. Find something interesting? Tsunade's grin and sarcastic tone was easily picked up by the redhead, who scowled at her even though she was obviously embarrassed. I didn't come here to be made fun of, Hokage-sama. Kitsune growled out. The blonde couldn't help but chuckle slightly. Don't worry about it, I'm allowed to make fun of family. Kitsune made to retort, but her mouth quickly shut as Tsunade's words sank in. Family? What are you getting at? I have no family. I can't anymore. You told me that you made your body based upon a template of those you were sealed in. I did some cross-referencing, and your genetic makeup matches my grandmother, Mito, much more than Kushina. For all intents and purposes, you're an Uzumaki, red hair and all. If I were to call you auntie, well, Tsunade shrugged, you're still reasonably close enough to my own genes for it to be true. While Kitsune wasn't too clear on all the medical talk, the one thing that she did pick up was that because of her chakra memory using what it remembered of Mito's, and to a much lesser extent Kushina's, body, she was technically an Uzumaki and was related to Tsunade. It was, strangely nice. She barely considered the other 8 Biju to be her siblings, and even then that was mostly due to Matatabi's recent influence. Previously, she couldn't have cared less. Now that she knew she was related to the human in front of her though, it was a surreal feeling, if she had to try to describe it. All of her memories she had of the importance humans placed on the meaning of family and familial bonds clogged up her thought processes, as she now had context to apply to those memories. There was likely a lot she still needed to learn about just what it meant, but to know that parts of her were somehow similar to parts of the Hokage, it was strange, but not in a bad way. Before I get into an in-depth discussion with you about human reproduction, there is one other little thing I can get out of the way. Kitsune looked at her. What was Tsunade supposed to be to her now? Her niece? She would have to clarify with the woman to see if she was joking about it or not. Regardless of that, she kept silent and simply waited to hear what the Hokage had to say. I need to make your registration a little more ethical now. I was able to get around some things because you were technically just a construct, but now that you have a permanent body we need to complete your paperwork a little more thoroughly. It won't take too long to finish. Tsunade started fiddling with one of the folders that she had set on the bed near where the chart had been laid. Opening it, she grabbed some papers out of it, then flipped through them until she found one she was looking for and handed it to Kitsune. The redhead began to peruse the contents as Tsunade continued explaining. I wasn't sure what you and Naruto might feel about it, but I've gone ahead and filled it all in as if you were an Uzumaki. I leave it up to you both to work out the specifics. The only thing you really need to choose is a birth date. June 22nd. Tsunade blinked at the rapid response. That didn't take you long. It's the day Naruto summoned me for the first time. How did you dash? Tsunade stopped herself, shaking her head as she sighed. Eidetic memory. I almost forgot. Kitsune didn't say anything, but continued looking over the paper with her new information. There were a few moments where the Hokage could have sworn she saw the redhead's lips twitch upward in a brief smile, but otherwise remained impassive until she finished. It wasn't long before Tsunade had the sheet of paper handed back to her. It looks fine to me, Kitsune stated. There is nothing you want to change. Kitsune shook her head. I gave you my birth date, and making it the same year as Naruto was a wise choice, as it makes things simpler in the long run. As for most of the other things I will let Naruto know what I have decided. He'll accept it. Tsunade chuckled as she placed all of her papers back into the folder she originally pulled them out of. You sound very confident. He is rather unpredictable, you know. Yes, I know. Kitsune revealed a rather coy grin, surprising Tsunade slightly. I do have the advantage that we are rather close, and he's never turned me down before. I think he'll be happy that I chose to be an Uzumaki. Kitsune briefly allowed a genuine smile, before turning to look out the window. For once in my long existence, I feel like I'm truly home. Age 16, Part 3. 1 month later, Kitsune woke slowly after feeling something shift next to her. As her eyes gradually opened, the redhead blinked a few times at the bright sunlight that was streaming in through the bedroom window. Turning her head to look at the clock nearby, she quickly noted the time before grumbling to herself upon realizing it was time to get up. Even if the aspect of having to sleep was new to her, it was something that she was coming to enjoy greatly. Her new body always felt refreshed after sleeping, not to mention it was nice having a period of time during the day where she was not always having to be constantly aware of everything in her surroundings, even when meditating. Twisting and rolling over to try to get out of the bed, she was stopped short by the feeling of an arm that was draped over her stomach. Looking over to the other side, she couldn't keep the beginnings of a grin off her face when she spotted to the sleeping visage of her favorite, fellow human. The blonde was still asleep and making a light snoring noise from right next to her. This was another one of the aforementioned things that the redhead had really started to enjoy about sleeping. Not only was it comfortable, but it was something she was able to do at the same time as Naruto. She didn't wear anything to bed other than an overly large t-shirt and undergarments. During the night her shirt often managed to get pulled up enough to where her skin would end up rubbing against Naruto's in some manner. While she no longer got the intense tingles as she had finally gotten used to having sensitive nerves compared to her normal Biju form, skin-on-skin contact was something she could admit to enjoying, but only if she felt like saying so. If asked why she liked it, it was impossible for her to think of an adequate response other than, just because. Not to mention it was strangely amusing to keep Naruto guessing about her true thoughts. Inhaling deeply, she carefully moved the blonde's arm off of herself and back over to his body, only stopping briefly when he let out a snort and then muttered something unintelligible in his sleep. Going through her vocabulary and the context of the various words she knew, the redhead quickly applied the word cute to the situation before leaning over to kiss the tip of his nose. It was something done on impulse, but she obtained further amusement upon watching as his face scrunched up briefly before evening out. Smiling openly now, she struggled to contain her emotions and giggles that wanted to burst forth as she watched him. Shaking her head, Kitsune finished moving his arm back over to his own body and slowly climbed out of the comfortable bed. Tsunade had warned her during following checkups that she'd probably find herself acting oddly from time to time, mostly because she would have to get used to dealing with, what was it called again? Oh yes, hormones. As a Biju with no gender, she had never had any interest in men or women by definition, mostly because she had no interest in the knowledge of the process of reproduction. Based on observations she had made long ago, she knew how to get both men and women to bow to her whims, but the actions themselves meant nothing. She knew the biological processes, certainly, but the reasons behind copulation when one wasn't intending to reproduce. She was clueless until about a month ago. Gradually interacting with Naruto over the years had opened her eyes, literally, to the meanings behind some interactions, and what it meant to care about another being, any entity, be they human or one of her fellow Biju. For a being that was originally created to only follow logic, or so she had believed in the beginning up until meeting Matatabi again, emotions were something that were intangible and had no meaning other than to apply a word to a situation. Hating someone or something was the first emotion she had ever really known, if only because it was so prevalent everywhere she went. There was always one human that wanted to do something bad to another. Sometimes they didn't even have to really do anything, only act or talk like they did. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there was another emotion called love. Kitsune's biggest problem in coming to understand that emotion, at least from the perspective of a logical being, was that there weren't really any examples of love that could be observed. The few times she had asked various humans she had talked to, the only explanation she got was that it was either used to express liking someone or something a lot, unconditionally even, or that you would just know. To make it even more difficult, there were supposedly different kinds of love to boot. In other words, love was the exact opposite of hatred. She had been going over these thoughts for days now, perhaps even longer, by wondering exactly what she thought and felt for the blonde-haired young man she had been with. Kitsune knew that she at the very least liked him, as he had been the first to give her as close to true freedom as she could get, along with a declaration to protect her from those who would use her for their own selfish ends. Was it more, though? There was one girl among their group, Hinata, who she knew claimed to love Naruto. It might be rude to ask her about why she felt that way, but the redhead knew from her casual get-togethers with Ino and the girls that they loved to gossip about these things. Perhaps some unobtrusive comments might help her get some better insight as to her own feelings. Then there was also Sakura to deal with. While they had been cordial to each other, and maybe even bordering on being decent friends for the past couple months, she had seen the looks that the other girl favored Naruto with from time to time. Thinking about it made her bristle a little. After all the time Naruto had tried to get the girl's attention, she had even helped once. It wasn't until now that the pink-haired girl had decided to really notice him. Talk about aggravating. Kitsune took a deep breath as she slowly wandered over to the bedroom window, gently pulling aside the curtain so that she could glance outside. Squinting as she adjusted to the bright morning sunlight, her bright red eyes slowly scanned the early morning crowd as they walked to their destinations. The building where their new home was located on one of the main paths that they called the Southern Concourse. It went straight from the central administration area all the way to the south gate. There were similar paths to the north and east, though most of the northern one was still closed off because of some lingering reconstruction. A slight rustling noise made her aware that Naruto was either awake or waking up. Briefly glancing over her shoulder, she observed as he managed to propel himself upright, then sit so his legs were off the side of the bed as he stretched. It wasn't until his bleary eyes settled on her that she shifted her gaze back to the window, once again roving over the buildings on the opposite side of the street. A moment later, a slight weight settled on her shoulder. It was hard, slightly pointy, and a bit uncomfortable, so without looking she quickly deduced that it was his chin. She was proven correct when a moment later his deep morning voice began to mumble next to her ear. "Mornin', hello." Naruto exhaled sharply, apparently amused at something if the vibrations of his chest against her back was any indication. "S'posed to say G mornin' when you just wake up, so you've said. Though how do you know if one morning is any better than the next? Why do you call it good?" Naruto hummed for a second before lifting his chin and moving away from her. "I think it's more because," he stopped talking as she heard him yawn from behind her. "Because you want it to be a good morning, even if it isn't one yet." "That makes no sense," Naruto grunted. Too early think about it too much." Before she could say anything else, she heard the bathroom door click shut followed by the sound of running water. Lips quirking up into a brief smile, Kitsune let her amusement show for a brief moment. She had found plenty of entertainment from Naruto in the mornings, at least when she awoke before he did. Another difference between her body and a normal human's that they had found out was that not only did she need minimal amounts of sleep to operate at peak condition, but when she woke from said sleep it only took her about 30 seconds to gain full cognitive function. Someone like Naruto though, it usually took 5 minutes or more when he wasn't out of the village or on assignment. Even if he was the only one she regularly woke up around, it still seemed like that was a lot of time to waste on waking up. Releasing the drape and moving away from the window, she shifted back over to the dresser that had her clothes in it. There were still some things she kept within the seal, but it was mostly stuff she didn't want Naruto or anyone else seeing, at least not yet. It's not that they were secret, but, well, okay, they were. The magazines she had taken up reading had given her plenty of ideas, even if some of them seemed rather outlandish. When asking about the validity of the magazines among her friends, Ino seemed very happy with her choice of reading material, while both Sakura and Tenten appeared more exasperated than anything else. Hinata, as usual, blushed fiercely but said nothing. She did get it confirmed from all of them, however, that while magazines claimed to be full of things like advice, it was very rarely proven advice. That essentially meant she was on her own for figuring things out. Relationship advice was hard to come by as none of the others she regularly talked to had anyone that they were seeing. To the contrary, they all seemed to be more interested in what she was, or wasn't, doing with Naruto as opposed to getting into a relationship of their own. Kitsune had yet to say anything about her and Naruto, even to the boy himself. However, judging by Hinata's declaration about a month ago and the way Sakura and other females were eyeing him now, she would have to soon. The only problem was that any time she even considered talking to Naruto about it, she began to sweat and feel uncomfortable, especially around her stomach. Shizune was the only one she had spoken to about it so far as she thought it was a medical issue, but the kunoichi had simply given her a comforting smile. Apparently even humanized Biju could feel butterflies. Her thoughts were interrupted as the door to the restroom opened and Naruto walked out, toweling his hair. Kitsune glanced at him momentarily, her eyes resting on the now always visible seal on his stomach before continuing to rifle through the dresser for her shinobi wear. Grabbing a set of the standard shinobi gear minus the vest, she tossed the clothing on the bed before grabbing her cloth binding wrap from the top of the dresser. Gathering up her clothes from the bed and walking past the blonde without a word, she headed for the bathroom to tape up her chest and get dressed, as she had already showered the night before. These were all things that were completely new to her, but it was almost as if she instinctually knew how to do them. That lent credence to what Matatabi had been telling her about how the Biju were all human once. Kitsune's skepticism had been continuously dwindling as time went on, considering she was doing things for what she knew was the first time, but yet performed them so automatically as if she had known how to do them all along. Taping up her chest like she was doing now, however, was an entirely new experience. She felt clothing in general was annoying, but when she went to spar with Naruto in her new body, her chest, among other body parts, began to cause her a lot of pain. Not to mention that pain in general was a new experience for her altogether, at least to such an extreme amount. Sure, she felt pain as a Biju, but it never felt anywhere near as intense as it did in human form. Perhaps because as a Biju she was a being of complete chakra and all of her physical sensations were diluted. Everyone she talked to on a somewhat regular basis, including Tsunade, only had theories. Reinforcing her body parts with chakra helped when sparring, but things like cuts from kunai still hurt like a bitch. The first cut she had received during training with Naruto had brought her to her knees, no matter that it had healed in less than a minute. It hurt like nothing she had ever experienced before. How Naruto or any shinobi managed to shrug them off she couldn't even begin to fathom, but like anything else it was something she was having to train herself to withstand or at least tolerate. Kitsune looked at herself in the mirror as she tied her hair up in its usual ponytail. It had actually grown faster than she thought it would, not that it was a problem for her. She had overheard Naruto talking with some of the other guys and he had mentioned that hair length didn't really matter to him, so she was going to let it grow out a little longer than the shoulder length she had been keeping it at. It had already grown down to about her shoulder blades, and at that rate in another month it would be at mid-back. After pulling on the dark blue shinobi pants and shirt, she left the restroom to see Naruto sitting on the bed, mostly dressed. He had on his orange pants and mesh shirt, but had foregone his jacket and instead had a dark blue shirt much like hers next to where he was sitting. Not saying a word, Kitsune moved over to her dresser once again, this time gathering up the cloth wrap for her right thigh that she attached her kunai pouch to. "Are you ready for today?" The redhead thought about it for a moment as she wrapped the white cloth around her leg. "I don't really know. I don't see why all this is necessary, honestly. Bachan didn't explain it. She usually likes to do stuff like that." Kitsune turned her head towards Naruto and gave him a flat look, only to see him still sitting there looking bored as he scratched at his cheek with a finger. "She did explain. I don't see why it's necessary. I was already doing D-rank missions as a construct, but since I'm human now I need to be legitimately tested for rank placement." If the blonde was going to say anything in response it was cut off when there was a series of rapid knocks on their apartment door. With a grunt Naruto pushed himself off the bed and quickly padded over to answer it. Kitsune knew it was likely someone coming to tell them where to report to for her test, so she simply continued wrapping the cloth, this time around her other leg. She had just randomly discovered that she was completely proficient in using either hand and arm, and as a ninja being ambidextrous did have its perks. Wearing a weapon pouch on each leg allowed her to make full use of this particular ability. Unfortunately, just because she was equally skilled with using both arms and hands didn't mean that her skills were totally up to par. As a construct she didn't really need to do much manual calibration, she only had to think about doing it and her chakra did it for her. While she was still able to use her chakra to reinforce herself, she had no memories of how human anatomy and musculature worked. No one could deny that she was a quick study and picked up skills at an astounding rate, as if she had done all this before, but on an overall scale since becoming human she was only graded at peak Chunin level, or around the same area that a large majority of the shinobi population reached and never surpassed. At least that was the case 3 weeks ago. Since then she had been training with Naruto and occasionally one of the others from his graduating class non-stop in an effort to prove herself. Part of Kitsune was wondering how much of her efforts were to please herself, or to please Naruto. Or perhaps she just wanted acknowledgement in her own way from everyone in the village. It was strange to think about, but she couldn't deny that she enjoyed the look of surprise on others' faces when she surpassed expectations. Hearing the door close, the redhead looked up from attaching the final holster as Naruto returned to the room. Well, we're to report to training ground 13 in a half an hour. Kitsune's head tilted to the side slightly, curious. Judging by the look on Naruto's face, his thoughts were running parallel with hers. They really asked for both of us. The blonde nodded, slowly. I thought I was the only one needing testing. So did I. Apparently not, and Crane, the ANBU, didn't know either. They asked for both of us, so I guess I should get geared up as well. How long will it take you to get ready? I think we should be there early. Naruto shrugged. 5 minutes, okay. Kitsune finished adjusting her outfit, giving herself one last look over in the mirror. She didn't think of herself as vain, at least not when comparing herself to other females she knew, but damn if she didn't look good. I'll meet you in the kitchen before we head out, I'm thirsty. You got it. 28 minutes later. You're on time. That's a good sign. Naruto and Kitsune came to a stop in front of an elderly man who had the right side of his head and arm wrapped up in bandages. On top of that, he was walking with a cane. Both of the new arrivals shared a look with each other before simultaneously looking at the other person standing nearby. I know you're wondering why I called for both of you to be here, Tsunade began. Gesturing at the bandaged man, she continued, this man here is Shimura Danzo. He's worked a lot with my old sensei in the past, and is the only shinobi still alive that did training under the Nidaime Hokage. He offered to help test you both as he has some unique talents that will test you in multiple ways. Even as the Hokage explained who the man was, her expression every time she glanced at the man could generally be described as unkind. Bachan, that doesn't explain why I need to be here. Momentarily focusing on the other blonde, Tsunade closed her eyes for a brief moment and sighed. As I was going to say, Naruto, you both will be working as or on a team most of the time. However, there are rules that need to be followed. In order for me to let you both go off and not take a Chunin team with you, you'll need to at least make Tokubetsu Jonin. It wasn't an issue before as Jiraiya was with you most of the time, but as he is now, indisposed. I can't let you go around without the proper support. Considering what I've seen from Naruto, I'm already willing to promote him, so I'm here to observe how Kitsune shapes up. She already passes as far as chakra reserves go, but I'll need to evaluate her combat ability before I'll consider allowing her to be your second, Naruto. Kitsune nodded, as she had been practicing for this very reason. Tsunade simply asked for Naruto to come along so she could directly assess how the two of them work together. As Kitsune is likely aware of the combat styles of most of your peers and that of their sensei, I have a limited pool of people I could pull from to properly test you. Danzo volunteered when he heard of my plight. Tsunade's eyes narrowed as she stared at the man next to her, but he was ignoring her in favor of keeping his visible eye closed as if in a meditative state. If there are no questions, I'll let Danzo get right to it. I'll simply be here in an observational capacity, and in case there are any injuries. With a nod, Tsunade turned to level a brief, deadpan stare at the older man, only to still be ignored, before promptly walking towards the nearby tree line. When she was a few paces away, Danzo talked to them for the second time. My test will, for the most part, be focused on Kitsune as she is the one who needs more testing to prove she is capable. Naruto, you will only intervene when it looks like she needs it. I won't give you any hints, so it will be up to you. Do it too soon, and it will reflect poorly on your judgment abilities. However, if you take too long it will do the same, plus Kitsune may suffer injury. Are you both prepared? Naruto looked over at Kitsune, but the redhead wasn't looking at him, she was glaring daggers at Danzo. Trying to figure out why she would be so angry already, the blonde somehow managed to hold his tongue as he watched the older man in front of them slowly unwrap the bandage around the right side of his face, only to reveal a Sharingan eye of all things. Where did you get that eye from? This time Naruto couldn't stop the question that immediately popped into his mind. Not only was he shocked, but he was also amazed that Tsunade knew and let him keep it, especially if he was willing to reveal it here. Danzo, however, only continued looking at him impassively. I'm a shinobi first and foremost. You don't believe I'm going to reveal the origins of this eye, do you? Have you ever asked Hatake Kakashi where he got his? Naruto considered tossing back a retort, while Kakashi had not explicitly stated as such. He had said several times his old teammate was an Uchiha, and it didn't take much to connect the dots from that point. However, any comments he might have said were stopped as Kitsune launched a fireball at the aged man, forcing him to dodge and stopping any conversation. Naruto had to squelch his first impulse, which was to immediately jump to Kitsune's defense. Worry started to pass over his features as Kitsune began launching fireball after fireball by flinging her hands in the directions that Danzo was moving, but she wasn't making hand signs. It might prove to be an interesting advantage in a real battle, but they were moving too slow to hit the surprisingly agile older man. Not only that, but he passively wondered what kind of chakra drain that was. They hadn't tested to see if there was any limits to the chakra in her new body, though like him she had never shown any signs of being tired. Once again he had to stop himself as Danzo finally got tired of dodging and finally sent a great break throw at her. Normally a wind technique would simply add fuel to a fire technique, but his was on a level that completely overpowered her fireballs to the point where it simply extinguished them. The blonde had to brace himself as the technique impacted the ground nearby, throwing up dirt, grass, and rocks. A thick dust settled over the area for a moment before several of the larger chunks of rock on the ground began melting, turning into a glowing lava. They lurched forward once, then twice, before literally flying off the ground after that directly at where Danzo landed. A stream of water erupted from Danzo's mouth, directly at the flying lava. A dense steam rapidly spread through the area surrounding the older man as the two connected, making Naruto wonder just what was going to happen next. He couldn't see through either of the people who were fighting, even though he could faintly sense that both of them hadn't moved another inch. Almost as if they were waiting for something. The stalemate didn't last much longer, though, as several braces worth of kunai went flying out of both clouds at almost the exact time. Amazingly, virtually every kunai collided with each other in the air too, making sparks fly all over the place. So many of them were colliding it was hard to tell who was trying to attack and who was trying to defend, though perhaps both of them were doing it at the same time. Finally, Kitsune came running out of the rapidly dispersing dust cloud that she had been standing in, moving swiftly towards Danzo in an attempt to engage him in taijutsu. This part Naruto was actually interested to see, as he had honestly not seen her fight with anyone other than himself, and wondered if he was the only one that had a hard time handling her. Of course he had gained a bit of an advantage when she finally got a real body, if only because she hadn't quite adjusted to ignoring pain, fatigue, and stress like he was able to yet. Honestly, Naruto wasn't sure if she'd ever have the tolerance he did, as there was still very little he understood about the body she had created. Kitsune had to do a little bit of fancy footwork as some of the ground underneath her began to resemble what looked like quicksand, though she jumped in the air and did a speedy series of hondeals. Lifting both index fingertips to her bottom lip, she blew out a steady stream of fire in a cone shape, literally glassing the sandy ground beneath her. As she landed amongst the flickering flames, Danzo ran forward to meet her head-on with a sword. Naruto examined it carefully, noticing that the man had his cane in his other hand. Oh. Clever. Kitsune held two kunai of her own, one in each hand that she held scissor-style to keep Danzo's blade from moving forward as they made contact. A few loud clangs, plus the sound of metal on metal made Naruto wince a little. Their quick clashes looked brutal and he could see the effort on the redhead's face as she struggled to stop the attacks and find openings of her own. He knew Kitsune was capable of using a blade, as she had used stick imitations often enough when sparring with him when they were still traveling. She hadn't since they returned, though, and he wasn't sure if there was a reason behind that or not. A strong overhead swing made Kitsune lift both of her arms to block, which Danzo took full advantage of. Lashing out with a leg, he caught her in the midsection, making the redhead stumble and fall backwards as she dropped her kunai and held her abdomen. Naruto was about to jump in and assist, though for some reason Danzo didn't move to make her yield, and instead appeared to wait for Kitsune to slowly make her way back to her feet. She scrambled for a moment to collect at least one of her kunai while the other held her stomach, but when she looked up at the older man her scrambling stopped and she instead continued to move at a much more sedate pace. Collecting one of the dropped kunai, she slowly rose to her feet, and appeared to settle into a semi-ready stance. Strangely, though, she didn't move any further. Naruto simply stared on, confused, at least until the seal around his abdomen began heating up. Curiosity changed into confusion as the seal continued getting warmer, meaning Kitsune was pulling on more and more chakra, though she wasn't really doing anything. Even Danzo had stopped, and had in fact moved to an idle position, going so far as to put his sword. Suddenly, it hit him. Kitsune only needed to pull upon the chakra still locked away in the seal when she didn't have enough in her own human body, and she had quite a lot of it. Since he couldn't see her doing anything, there was only one thing that could be happening. Jumping forward, Naruto got between her and Danzo, then moved one of his hands forward to touch her cheek. She didn't register his movement, or his contact, which meant that it was as he feared. Sending a jolt of his own chakra into her, the redhead almost immediately let out a gasp before he noticed her eyes immediately focus on him. At first, Kitsune had a look of rage, like she couldn't believe she had been caught in a genjutsu. But it quickly faded into a saddened, yet almost relieved look. She tilted her head further against Naruto's palm and took a step forward, so that her forehead rested against his chest. I believe that is the end of this little test. The blonde held back from saying what was immediately on his mind. Yes, I believe it is, he drawled out slowly instead. Since he noticed Tsunade was approaching quickly, he simply left it at that. Danzo said nothing either. It didn't take long for Tsunade to reach them, and Naruto noted with no small amount of relief that she immediately began pestering Danzo. It's over already. It hasn't even been 10 minutes. What the hell did you do? Naruto wasn't facing them, as he was more concerned about Kitsune, who still wasn't moving or saying anything. Actually, she had moved close enough to press her entire torso against his at this point, and had even wrapped her arms around his waist. It was very unusual. I thought you were only going to use that eye to give her a good fight, not to place her in a genjutsu. Tsunade genjutsu are part of a fight dash, not with the Sharingan, damn it. We went over this. The blonde wasn't trying hard to listen in, after all the Hokage was almost shouting at this point. He was going to attempt to talk to Kitsune, but she seemed to be strangely content to just stand there holding him. Mentally shrugging, he slowly worked his arms around her back as well, and once he had done so he felt her arms briefly tighten then relax against him. For all intents and purposes, she appeared to be calm and normal, though he couldn't see her face right now and he couldn't feel her heartbeat through the vests they both wore. He didn't hear Tsunade say anything about dismissing Danzo, but he did hear her sigh and then the sound of grass crunching under her feet as she moved over to them. As she moved over into his line of sight, it was obvious to see both the exasperation and worry on her features. Ugh, Danzo. I can't believe the nerve of that man. I'm sorry, both of you. Even though she had addressed it to both of them, her eyes were completely focused on the redhead. What was that all about anyway, Bachan? Instead of getting angry at him for using the nickname, she crossed her arms and sighed, looking back off into the direction that Danzo had apparently left in. I don't know how exactly he heard about it, but he did know that I was going to test both of you. He appeared to be more interested in testing Kitsune though. She stopped for a moment to pinch the bridge of her nose as she shook her head. I should have known, but perhaps I really did want to believe that he had everyone's best interests at heart this time. There were others I could have pulled to test you both, but there are very few shinobi with Danzo's overall level of experience. Naruto nodded slowly, not sure what else to say. He knew of Danzo, of course, but he didn't really know anything about the man other than he caused some people headaches. He was obviously skilled, and having the Sharingan only made him more so. A slight grimace passed over his face as he thought about the Sharingan. It was hard enough to fight against, but Kitsune had an inherent weakness against them. Since the only person he regularly encountered that had one was Kakashi, it wasn't something that he really thought about. That would have to change now though, since there were still non-friendly Sharingan out in the world to deal with. Tsunade snapping her fingers in front of his face pulled him out of his thoughts. Sorry, Bachan, I was thinking about things. The blonde woman snorted, and Naruto's eyes were drawn to where her glowing green hand was pressed against Kitsune's forehead. What's wrong? The Hokage shook her head, frowning. I'm not 100% sure, but she's minimally responsive right now. It looks like she has a surplus of chakra and it's wreaking havoc on her nervous system. In fact, based on what I can feel, her chakra seems to be focused around her stomach, where her seal is located. She's likely trying to subconsciously give it back to where it came from, but your seals aren't designed that way to the best of my knowledge. No, they aren't, Naruto agreed. I might be able to work on something though. Good. Tsunade nodded and pulled her hand away. If nothing else, it would let you easily break any genjutsu in the future, especially if your own chakra could travel between the seals whenever necessary. For now though, she needs to release a lot of excess chakra. Normally I'd put her to sleep and let it burn off naturally, but there is too much and it may damage her body. Naruto frowned as he glanced down his nose to look at the top of Kitsune's head. He had an idea since he was familiar with manipulating her chakra, but he didn't know how well it would work. There was only one way to find out. I need to check her seal. Can you make sure she doesn't fall over? One of Tsunade's eyebrows arched upwards, but she nodded slowly and moved over behind Kitsune, grabbing the woman's shoulders. When the Hokage had a decent grip, Naruto managed to pull himself out of Kitsune's grasp with only minor difficulty. The redhead was completely fixated on him, but only with her eyes. Her face was set in an expressionless mask, which was completely unusual for her. It made him slightly uncomfortable. Her expression remained unchanged even after he unzipped her vest, and still as he crouched down and lifted up her shirt slightly so that he could examine the seal. Other than her hands shaking as they clenched and released, she hadn't uttered a single word. Now it was just making him unnerved. The Kitsune he knew would never let a moment like this pass either without letting loose. Not that she'd have let him get this far. Tsunade spoke up again as she tried to watch from over Kitsune's shoulder. What's your plan? Naruto tried to keep his eyes from roaming as he stared at the seal on the redhead's well-defined abdomen. I'm just going to tweak the seal so I can pull her chakra from it. I think the best thing to do is to make a few shadow clones, since they'll quickly bring her chakra down to a manageable level. He didn't listen to anything Tsunade might have said as a follow-up as he focused intently on the seal, finding the exact spot he needed to tweak. Gently placing the tips of his forefinger, index finger, and thumb on her skin where the seal was located, he channeled a small amount of chakra into them and twisted them clockwise. The seal morphed slightly, and he became aware as the redhead let out a gasp. Her hands reached out to grab his shoulders, but Naruto focused and placed the palm of his hand in the middle of the design around her navel. Making a half seal with his free hand, he concentrated on pulling chakra from her seal and performing a technique. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. There was a flash of red from the seal, and Naruto felt a brief feeling of fire traveling through his veins. There were numerous flashes of smoke in the area immediately surrounding the three of them, and the blonde couldn't help but quirk his lips into a small smile. Well, I didn't know it would happen like that, he mumbled. There were too many to get a quick count, but there were plenty of copies of Kitsune now standing there staring at the three of them. Most of them seemed to be a mix between amused and relieved, but a few were looking in the direction of their stomachs before looking back at him with an interested expression. Naruto. He heard his name, it almost sounded as if it was an exasperated sigh, before looking back up at the original Kitsune. The moment he did so her hands went limp on his shoulders, and he tried to catch her as she toppled forward. Luckily Tsunade still had a grip on the redhead's shoulders, therefore she didn't get very far before the Hokage lowered her slowly to the ground. Is she going to be okay? There was no hiding the worry in his voice. Instead of answering right away, Tsunade's hand was covered in greenish-hued chakra as she placed it against the other woman's forehead. Before long she moved it down over her heart, then her navel, before finally nodding. She'll be fine. Her chakra levels have normalized, though she'll be a little more worn out than usual because I don't think she's had that much chakra released from this body at once before. Has she ever used shadow clones before? Naruto looked at the clones around them, who seemed to be extremely interested at what was going on, before shaking his head. Not that I know of, no. I see. Tsunade sighed briefly before checking over Kitsune one more time, then nodded and stood up from where she was crouched. I suggest you take her home and make sure she gets plenty of rest. I'll see about getting some other jonin to test you two again, though just from the short time she actually got to fight I think she'd do fine under normal circumstances. Naruto nodded at his boss before looking down at Kitsune, who was quietly resting. He began to shift his position so that he could pick her up and head back home, but stopped when a few throats nearby cleared themselves. Startled, he looked up again, only to see that he had quite a few clones of Kitsune who were still staring at him. You're leaving already? Asked one of the red-headed clones. We don't want you to leave so soon with the boss, Naruto-kun. Mumbled another. A third clone either worked up its nerve or simply decided to partake in different sorts of instincts, as it stepped up closer and lifted up the front of its shirt enough to let him see a replication of the seal on its abdomen. "I don't know about the others, but I still have tingles where you touched the boss," the copy purred. Several others must have felt the same, as quite a few hands quickly moved to rest over their stomachs. A few others were making comments that he was half listening to, as he was a little too shocked to completely comprehend what was going on. He didn't get long to think about it, however, as one of the clones leaned into his back, wrapping arms around his neck and resting its chin on his shoulder, lips near his ear. "Naruto-kun, won't you play with us? The boss will be fine, we'll take care of her." The blonde felt blood rushing to his face. He couldn't help but wonder if Kitsune was normally like this and was just hiding it, or if her clones were just having fun at his expense. Most likely the latter. He let out a chuckle before looking up at the clone who was still holding her shirt up a little. "So you all want to have fun?" The clone that was hovering near his ear let out a moan, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The one in front of him simply nodded, trailing a finger from her free hand down the center of her stomach. Other clones were looking antsy, while others seemed to be having a hard time keeping themselves from simply jumping him. He let out a small burst of his own chakra in a burst, making the clone that was holding him let out a little yelp and jump a step back. Before any other words were said, he held his hands up together in a pose he could do in his sleep now if he had to. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The area was covered in smoke once again, only this time after it was blown away there were countless copies of himself spread out amongst those of Kitsune. There was silence in the area for a while before the noise started growing as they began talking to each other. Finally, when there was a random shout of "Rasengan" from somewhere in the crowd, all hell broke loose. The real Naruto scrambled to pick up Kitsune and get them out of there before any stray techniques got too close. Of course, that wasn't to say he didn't catch a few good eyefuls on the way out of that training area. He knew that his clones had somewhat reduced inhibition since they knew they weren't real, but he hadn't fully thought about how it might affect Kitsune as well. No matter. He'd get her home, then go take a very long cold shower. Then mentally psych himself up for when Kitsune invariably decided to beat him into a bloody paste. He was already getting some memories from a few dispelled clones and, oh man, completely, hopelessly, utterly, doomed.